The prisoner would not stop smiling. That was the detail nobody could explain afterward. Not the officers who filed the report, not the analysts who reviewed the interrogation logs, not the senior commander who had authorized the capture in the first place. The man had been taken from a burning ship. His crew was gone. His mission had failed completely. Every material fact of his situation pointed toward defeat, toward the particular despair that follows total collapse. And he sat across from his captor, hands bound, ship destroyed, future dissolved, and smiled. Not from madness, not from the performance of bravado that frightened men sometimes attempted. The smile was quiet, almost private, the kind that surfaces when something you suspected turns out to be true. The captor across from him was not human. Blue skin, red eyes, a stillness so complete it registered less like calm and more like the absence of everything ordinary. The rank insignia on the white uniform indicated a level of authority that should have made the prisoner pale. Instead, the prisoner looked at the face across from him and said, in a voice too low for the recording equipment to fully capture, "You already knew, didn't you, before we jumped? You knew exactly where we were going." The blue-skinned officer did not answer immediately. When he did speak, his voice carried no satisfaction, no pride, just the flat, patient quality of someone confirming a thing that required no confirmation. "I knew before you did," he said. The prisoner's smile held for another moment. Then something shifted behind it. Not fear, not anger, but a specific kind of grief. The grief of a man who has just understood the full distance between himself and the thing that caught him. The recording ends there. What happened in the room afterward was not documented. His name, in full, required a Chiss tongue to say correctly. The Empire compressed it to something manageable. Thrawn. One syllable, sharp, final, the sound of a door closing. He had accepted the compression without comment. Acceptance without comment was a skill he had been refining since long before the Empire existed, since the first time being right had cost him something, since the morning a senior Chiss commander had looked at a border that was still standing because of decisions made without authorization and called those decisions reckless. That morning was a long time ago. Now the Chimera moved through hyperspace at the 3rd hour, and the Grand Admiral stood in his private gallery with his hands clasped behind his back, studying a piece of Togrutan weaving that most people would have walked past without slowing down. The gallery was not large. For a man of his rank aboard a ship of this size, the space allocated to personal quarters was usually spent on comfort. Wide bunks, private dining, the accumulated decorative weight of imperial ceremony. What lined these walls instead was art. 43 distinct cultures represented across pedestals and display mounts, and carefully angled lighting. A carved stone fragment, a clay figure small enough to hold in one palm, a textile from a species that had been resisting imperial expansion for 11 years. The Togrutan weaving held the far wall. Red and ivory threads, pulled in patterns that shifted as you moved, symmetrical from one angle, deliberately broken from another. Most eyes registered it as decorative and continued on. His eyes had not continued on in 3 nights of standing here. Outside the viewport, hyperspace made white lines of everything. The stars were gone, compressed into motion, the universe blurred past any fixed point. His reflection sat faintly in the dark transparistile behind the textile, a shape in white and blue, barely there, almost absorbed into the light. Almost, not quite. That had always been the particular condition of his existence, present enough to be impossible to ignore, foreign enough to never be fully absorbed. The Empire's most decorated non-human officer, standing in a gallery at the 3rd hour, reading threads that his fleet would go to war over tomorrow morning, and not a single person on this ship who could have explained, if asked, exactly how that process worked. He had stopped expecting them to understand it. Understanding was not, in any case, what the Empire required from its officers. What the Empire required was results. He provided results. The arrangement had functioned for years on that basis, and would continue to function, and the gap between what he was and what the institution around him was capable of recognizing, that gap was simply part of the cost. He had filed it under acceptable losses long ago. The weaving was unfinished. That was the part that had brought him back 3 nights running. Not abandoned. The distinction mattered enormously. The materials for completing the lower right corner had been gathered at the frame's edge, tucked and waiting, everything prepared for threads that were never laid down. An abandoned work left loose ends, fraying tension, the physical evidence of a hand pulled away suddenly. This was different. The tension in every completed section was exact and deliberate, the work of someone fully in control of what they were doing. The incompletion was chosen, executed with the same precision as everything surrounding it. The artist had stopped on purpose, had built the entire piece as architecture for a gap. Every thread existed to frame what was withheld. The absence was the statement. The absence was, in fact, the most confident thing in the room. What this meant for the engagement scheduled at dawn, he turned it quietly in his mind as he stood there. A culture that embedded this specific quality into its art did not fight from pride. Pride produced different shapes in creative work: symmetry, completion, the insistence that the thing made was finished and correct. This artist had made something else entirely, had said, through the work, "The world is not finished. Pretending otherwise is a form of dishonesty we refuse." A people who believed that, down deep enough to put it in their textiles, would recognize the moment a battle was no longer winnable and adapt, not from cowardice, but from a philosophy of honest accounting. They would not spend lives on positions that could not hold. They would shift, preserve something, continue. Knowing this, 3 adjustments to tomorrow's formation became obvious. He had already drafted them. His officers would receive the updates before first watch. None of the documents would mention art. They never did. He had grown up on the cold outer edge of the Chiss Ascendancy, in a region of space the Republic had barely mapped and largely chose to ignore. The Ascendancy did not announce itself to the wider galaxy. It maintained, held lines against pressures moving in from the unknown regions, threats that had no political declaration attached to them, dangers that did not send ambassadors before they arrived. The Chiss were precise and disciplined, and deeply, structurally conservative. The system they had built worked. Their borders held. The darkness beyond stayed, mostly, beyond. What the system had not anticipated was a mind that could see threats before they fully formed. His earliest commanders had recognized the ability and found it useful, right up until the morning it operated without their permission. The border engagement that followed was minor. A patrol, a threat assessed as manageable, placed in the standard response queue. He had reviewed the assessment and found the conclusion wrong, not the facts. The facts were correct. The conclusion drawn from them was not. The threat, managed at the queued level, would grow. Addressed immediately and at scale, it would end cleanly. He addressed it immediately, at scale. The border held. The settlements beyond that border kept their people. The threat closed like a door. His commander's report used the word reckless 4 times. He had stood in that office and listened to a word that described the opposite of what had occurred, and absorbed a lesson that no officer training had been designed to teach. Precision frightens people who cannot trace its origins. A result they cannot explain feels more dangerous to them than a failure they understand. being right, in ways that made the mechanism of rightness invisible, produced in observers not confidence but suspicion. He noted this, quietly, without bitterness. Bitterness would have been imprecise. The commendations came. So did the reprimands, attached like shadows to the very actions that had earned the commendations. Promotions arrived alongside quiet conversations about the political weight of operating outside approved frameworks. Every superior he had ever served used some version of the same language. Exceptional, but. The word after but changed. The structure never did. The Ascendancy wanted what he could do. It was deeply uncomfortable with how he did it. The formal exile, when it came, was dressed in careful language, a reassignment, a posting to distant sector, necessary restructuring. The political figures behind it were not wrong to be cautious. An officer of his capability, operating at the center of Ascendancy command, accumulated influence in ways that outpaced the structures designed to contain it. Moving him to the edge was not punishment for failure. It was management of success. He went without protest. Not because protest was beneath him. It was not, and they knew it. Because silence was the more precise instrument. Silence communicated that their discomfort had been observed, weighed, and found insufficient to alter his bearing. The exile did not diminish him. What it did, eventually, was position him at the exact edge of known space, where a different power was looking for exactly what he was. The Empire's scout vessel appeared 3 months into that first posting. The officer aboard had careful eyes and a prepared speech. The questions were too specific for improvisation. Someone had been building a file on him for longer than this conversation implied. He had asked directly who authorized the approach. The officer had smiled the way people smile when the answer exceeds the room. He had accepted the posting, not from desperation, not from bitterness toward the Ascendancy. From the cold arithmetic of available options, one institution had offered belonging without scope, the other was offering scope without belonging. Between the two, scope was the one that let him do what needed doing. What needed doing was large, getting larger. The threats in the unknown regions were not political abstractions. They were real, and old, and patient in ways that the Empire, with its appetite for present dominance, had no framework for understanding. Someone needed to stand between those threats and the galaxy they were moving toward. Someone needed the resources and the authority to do it at the necessary scale. The Ascendancy could not provide that. The Empire could. The Emperor, whatever else he was, recognized utility with a clarity that cut through every other consideration. That would have to be enough. The Chimera held its course through hyperspace. Outside every viewport, on every deck, the stars were white lines and the universe was motion and nothing was fixed. In the gallery, at the ship's quietest hour, the Grand Admiral stood in front of a textile that most people would never stop to read it, and understood from it something that would shape the lives of thousands of people before the next day ended. His reflection waited in the dark transparisteel behind the weaving, blue and still, patient the way deep space is patient, not with effort, just by nature, just as a condition of what it is. 43 cultures on these walls, 43 windows into the interior of peoples who would never have chosen to be studied by the man studying them now. What they feared, what they protected when everything collapsed, what they believed, down at the level where beliefs become bone rather than language. He had read all of it, not because the Empire asked him to, because understanding was the only honest response to existence, because a galaxy full of people building and painting and weaving and carving their deepest truths into physical objects deserved, at minimum, to be seen accurately. Because the alternative, to look at another culture's art and see only decoration, only foreign, only irrelevant, was a form of blindness he had never been able to tolerate. The Empire was very good at that particular blindness. He served it anyway. The scope required it. The mission required it. And so he stood here, night after night, in the third hour, reading what the world had made of itself, and filing it alongside everything else he carried. Every border held, every exile absorbed, every silence deployed in place of protest, every room where he had been the most observed person present, and simultaneously the least understood. The weaving's unfinished corner held its deliberate gap in the amber light. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned back to the viewport, and his reflection settled into the dark transparisteel, blue and barely visible, carrying everything it knew into the long white blur of hyperspace. The battle tomorrow was already decided. The only people who did not know this yet were the ones who would be fighting it. There is a particular kind of cold that does not come from temperature. The Chiss knew it well. Every family on the outer edge of the Ascendancy understood it. The cold that settled into a room when a decision had already been made before the conversation began. When the words being spoken were formality, and the outcome was already written somewhere you were not permitted to read. It was not the cold of cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledged you enough to want something from you. This was the cold of administration, of careful people making careful choices about assets they could not afford to lose and could not afford to fully trust. Mitth'raw'nuruodo had grown up breathing that cold, not because his family was disfavored, the opposite. The Myth family held a position within the Ascendancy's 9 ruling families that came with expectation attached to every meal, every word, every choice made in public or private. Children born into that position learned early that the weight of a name was not decorative. It was structural. It held things up. It also, if you were not careful, held you down. He had been careful. He had also, from very young, been something the careful planning of careful families had not quite anticipated. The Ascendancy's officer training began formally at 14. In practice, for children of the ruling families, it began much earlier, in the way dinner conversations turned naturally to border logistics, in the way elders described the unknown regions, not as mystery, but as problem, in the way every story told around a Chiss table eventually arrived at the same destination, the darkness beyond the edge, and what was moving inside it. He had listened to those stories with a quality of attention that his instructors would later try to name and find themselves reaching for words that didn't quite fit. Focused was too simple. Intense implied aggression he did not display. What he brought to a problem was something closer to stillness, a complete cessation of the internal noise that most minds generate when they encounter difficulty. Where other students accelerated under pressure, he slowed down. Where others reached for the first answer that presented itself, he waited. Waited past the point that made people uncomfortable. Waited until the answer that was actually correct surfaced beneath the ones that merely seemed correct. His first formal instructor, a woman named Ivaro, whose family had held border command positions for 4 generations, had written in her assessment at the end of his first year, "This student's primary difficulty is not capability, but pace. He will arrive at conclusions that others cannot match. He will arrive at them after everyone else has committed to a different direction. The friction this creates is his responsibility to manage." He had read the assessment, had noted the framing, that the friction was his responsibility, not the product of a system that could not hold his pace, had filed it. He was 14. The unknown regions were not dark in the way that deep space is dark. Empty, cold, the simple absence of light and heat. They were dark the way an old building is dark, after the power fails, full of shapes you cannot quite see, sounds that stop when you turn toward them, the persistent feeling that the darkness knows you are there, even when you cannot find it. The threats that moved inside that darkness did not announce themselves. They did not send political representatives or file territorial claims with the Republic's Senate. They moved, they pressured, they tested borders with a patience that operated on timescales most military planning could not account for. The Chiss understood this because the Chiss had been holding those borders for centuries. They had learned to read the darkness the way farmers read weather, not from instruments alone, but from accumulated knowledge passed through generations of people who had stood at the same edge and watched the same signals. Young officers were taken to the border as part of their formal training, not to fight, to look. He remembered standing at the observation deck of a small border station, 17 years old, watching the sensor feeds from the outer perimeter. Most of his cohort had found the exercise tedious. 3 hours of watching data streams that showed nothing dramatic, nothing conclusive, nothing that required immediate action. Some had quietly reviewed other materials. Some had talked among themselves in low voices. He had watched every second, not because he had been told to, because something in those data streams was speaking, and he wanted to hear what it said. The pressure patterns at the outer markers were irregular, in a way that standard analysis flagged as atmospheric interference, and moved past. He had stared at them for 40 minutes before understanding why they bothered him. The irregularity had a rhythm, faint, inconsistent, easy to dismiss, but rhythmic, not weather, not system noise. Something was testing the marker, gently, repeatedly, learning its response time. He had brought this to the senior officer on station, had explained the pattern clearly, had shown the data points, had laid out the conclusion in terms that left no interpretive gap. The senior officer had thanked him, filed the report in the standard queue, and returned to other matters. 3 months later, the marker position was overrun. He was not told he had been right. He did not need to be told. What mattered, the only thing that mattered, was that the marker was gone, and the people who had depended on it were gone with it. And a report that could have prevented both had sat in a queue for 3 months, because the system had a process, and the process had a pace, and nothing was permitted to move faster than the pace. That was the second lesson the cold taught him. The first had been patience. The second was the specific cost of patience in a system that mistook process for wisdom. His formal career in the Ascendancy's military began at 22, after training that his instructors assessed as exceptional in terms that grew increasingly uncomfortable as the assessments accumulated. He was assigned to a patrol vessel on the mid-border, not the outer edge, where the real pressure lived, but the secondary line, where the work was administrative and the dangers were manageable, and officers were expected to develop steadily within approved frameworks. He developed faster than the framework had designed for. The patrol routes that were assigned to him began producing intelligence at a rate that the Border Command's Analysis Division struggled to process. Not because he was working harder than other officers, the hours were the same, the resources identical, because he was reading what he saw differently. Every system his vessel passed through was a text. The debris patterns, the communication traffic, the specific distribution of civilian shipping versus military traffic. Each element was a word in a sentence, and the sentences, read together, told stories the standard reporting forms had no category for. He created the categories himself, submitted them alongside the reports. His commanding officer reviewed the new categories, found them logical, and forwarded them up the chain without attribution. This happened 4 times before he stopped noting it. Attribution was not the point. The border was the point. If the categories helped hold the border, the categories had served their purpose. The name attached to them was a detail that the mission did not require. He believed this completely at 22. By 30, he still believed it. The believing had simply become more expensive. The Chiss, when they were not performing the formality that ruling family culture required, spoke differently. There was a register that existed below the official one, shorter sentences, less ceremonial structure, the particular directness of people who lived close to genuine danger and had decided that clarity was more valuable than elegance. He had grown up hearing both registers. He was fluent in both. What he loved, specifically, was the moment a conversation shifted from the formal to the direct, the almost physical change in a room when the performance ended and the actual communication began. It happened most often late in evenings, when the official business of a gathering had concluded, and people were left with each other without agenda. The quality of the silence between sentences changed. The eyes stopped performing and started seeing. He had always felt more at home in that register, in the direct, unperformed version of his people. The difficulty was that the version of him his career required, precise, controlled, operating always within a framework of institutional language, did not naturally produce the conditions for that directness. The higher his position, the more layers of formality surrounded every exchange. Rank was, among other things, a barrier between a person and anyone who might speak to them honestly. He had understood this young and had never found a satisfying solution to it. What he had found instead was art. Art, from any culture, was the direct register made permanent. It was what a people said when they stopped performing for outsiders and made something true for themselves. A piece of work, created without audience in mind, carried a quality of honesty that even the most guarded diplomatic exchange could not manufacture. The Togrutan weaving on his gallery wall said more about Togrutan interiority than any number of official cultural briefings, because the briefings were made for the formal register, and the weaving was made for something else entirely. He had started collecting at 26, a small carved figure from a species whose name the Ascendancy's records did not contain, acquired from a trader who did not know what it was, sold for almost nothing, placed on the corner of his desk aboard the patrol vessel. He would look at it between reports, not to decorate the space, to keep the other register present, to remember that below all the institutional language and the formal assessment frameworks and the career trajectories and the political calculations, there were actual people making actual things that meant something to them. It helped him stay accurate. It helped him stay honest. It could not, in the end, help him stay. The engagement that produced his first formal exile was not, by any external measure, a catastrophe. The Ascendancy's border held. The threat that had been building along a specific outer marker, one he had identified and reported through proper channels 8 months before the situation became critical, was neutralized. The settlements beyond that line were intact. The people inside them went about their lives without knowing how close the margin had been. What produced the exile was the method. He had acted before authorization arrived. The authorization had been in process. He knew this, had confirmed it through the appropriate communications, but the timeline of the threat had compressed faster than the authorization process could accommodate. He had run the calculation in the time available and determined that waiting for the formal approval would result in the border failing and the settlements emptying. He had acted on that calculation. The action was successful. The response from the ruling council was not. Not because anyone disputed the result. The result was not in question. What was in question was the decision, the choice to move outside the authorized framework, to treat his own assessment as sufficient authorization, to operate as though his judgment superseded the system's process. This, the council had explained in careful language, was not about this specific engagement. It was about precedent. An officer who overrode authorization when he was right created a framework in which authorization itself became conditional, dependent on the officer's confidence in his own judgment. And no system, however effective that judgment might be, could function on that basis. He had listened to the entire address without speaking. When it was finished, he had asked one question: how many people would have died if I had waited for the authorization? The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own answer. The exile posting was announced the next morning. The station at the edge of the Ascendancy's formal territory was small and cold, and very far from anything that mattered in the way institutions measured mattering. The posting was framed as temporary, a period of reflection, an opportunity to demonstrate that the qualities which made him valuable could be channeled within appropriate structures. What it actually was, what everyone understood without saying, was a message. The Ascendancy was communicating, through the mechanism of distance and diminished responsibility, that genius was easier to hold when it was slightly off balance, that an officer who had never been reminded of the limits of his position might eventually stop acknowledging that limits existed. The exile was not punishment for the engagement. It was maintenance of a dynamic the ruling families required to function. He understood this completely. Understanding it did not make the cold of the station feel warmer. He spent his time there the way he spent time everywhere, observing, reading, building frameworks. The traffic patterns through this outer sector told their own stories. The pressure from the unknown regions was detectable even here, faint but consistent. The same rhythmic testing he had identified as a 17-year-old on the observation deck of a border station. Still moving, still patient, still learning the response time of every marker it pressed against. He wrote reports that went into queues. He collected a piece of carved stone from a passing trade vessel, worked in a style he did not recognize, from a culture he had no record of, the angles of the carving suggesting a relationship to physical space that no Chiss or Republic aesthetic had ever approached. He placed it beside the small figure on his desk, looked at both of them in the quiet of the night cycle, thought about the darkness beyond the edge and what was moving inside it, and how much time the authorization processes of cautious institutions would take before the margin closed completely. The Empire's scout vessel arrived on a morning that felt like all the other mornings. The officer who stepped off it had careful eyes and a prepared speech and questions that were too specific to be improvised. Someone had built a file. Someone had been watching this posting for longer than this visit implied. He had let the officer finish the speech before responding. Then he had looked out the viewport at the cold outer edge of the only home he had ever known. The dark beyond the Ascendancy's markers, patient and rhythmic, pressing against every line the careful families had spent centuries holding. He had thought about authorization processes. He had thought about queues. Then he had turned back to the officer with the careful eyes and said, "In the direct register, the one below the formal, tell me what you actually need." The cold of the station settled around that sentence and held it. Outside, the darkness beyond the edge continued its patient work. Inside, something that had been waiting for exactly the right problem had just found one large enough to deserve it. The throne room on Coruscant was designed to make you feel small, not through size alone, though the scale was enormous, the ceilings pulling upward into darkness that the lighting had been carefully arranged to suggest was infinite. The smallness came from something more deliberate than architecture. It came from the quality of attention at the room's center, from the figure seated at the far end who watched you walk the entire length of that floor without moving, without speaking, without offering any of the social signals that most powerful people deployed to manage the discomfort of those approaching them. Palpatine did not manage discomfort. He collected it. Most people who made that walk arrived diminished by the time they reached the steps. The distance had done its work. The silence, the weight of the gaze, the accumulating sense that everything you had prepared to say had already been assessed and found either useful or irrelevant before you opened your mouth. Ambassadors had been known to forget the first sentence of addresses they had rehearsed for weeks. Military commanders with decades of experience had found their voices requiring conscious effort to project. Mitth'raw'nuruodo walked the length of that floor and arrived at the steps with the same expression he had carried through the entrance, still, attentive, present in the way that deep water is present, surface calm, no indication of what moved underneath. The Emperor looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in those yellow eyes, not warmth, not approval, something more precise than either, the particular quality of a mind that has processed a great deal of data across a long life and rarely encounters input that requires recalibration. "Interesting," the Emperor said. It was the first word spoken in that room in 4 minutes. The path from the outer station to that throne room had taken 14 months and covered more institutional distance than most careers managed in a decade. The Empire's processing of a Chiss defector, which was the formal category applied to his situation, regardless of how imprecise the word defector was for someone who had been sent to the edge by his own people and collected from there by someone else's, was not swift. There were interviews, assessment panels, security reviews that examined his service record in the Ascendancy, with a thoroughness that implied the Empire had sources inside Chiss intelligence that neither side had formally acknowledged. There were tests, tactical simulations, strategic assessments, psychological evaluations administered by officers who believed they were measuring him and did not realize they were being measured in return. He performed adequately on the exercises designed to produce adequate performance. On the exercises designed to reveal ceiling, the problems constructed to have no clean solution. The simulations that introduced variables mid-sequence to see how a mind handled genuine uncertainty. He performed in ways that the evaluation officers noted carefully and then apparently escalated, because the nature of the interviews changed after the 3rd week. Different people entered the rooms, higher rank, better questions. He had adjusted accordingly. By the 6th month, he was being housed in quarters that no longer resembled a processing facility. By the 9th, he was attending operational briefings as an observer. By the 11th, a junior officer named Eli Vanto appeared outside his door one morning, with the specific expression of someone who had just received an assignment they had not requested and were too professional to visibly resent. "Lieutenant Eli Vanto," the young man had said, standing very straight. "I've been assigned as your aide, sir." He had studied Vanto for a moment. The posture, the eyes, the particular quality of someone performing composure over something more complicated. "You are from wild space," he had said. "Your family has trade history in Chiss territory." Vanto had blinked. "Yes, sir. That is why you were chosen." He had stepped back to allow the lieutenant inside, not to translate. "My basic requires no assistance. You were chosen to report." Another blink. Then, slowly, something that was almost respect replaced the composure. "Yes, sir." "Good," he had said. "I prefer honesty to performance. We will work together well." Eli Vanto was 23 years old and had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy with marks that placed him in a category his instructors described as exceptional but directionless. A mind that could execute at the highest level but had not yet found a problem large enough to deserve it. He came from a family that had spent 2 generations building trade relationships with outer rim species, which had given him an instinctive comfort with alien physiognomy and culture that most imperial officers did not possess and many actively disdained. What it had not given him was any preparation for Thrawn. The first month of their working arrangement produced in Vanto a visible series of recalibrations. assumptions he had carried about how intelligence worked, how military planning functioned, what the relationship between information and action actually was. He would watch his superior study something, a sensor report, a piece of art, a trading manifest from a civilian vessel, and then watch the decisions that followed, and the gap between what he could trace and what had actually occurred in that interval would show briefly on his face before he smoothed it away. He was, to his credit, a fast smoother. By the second month, Vanto had stopped trying to trace the reasoning in real time and started observing the results first, working backward from outcomes to understand the process. This was, as it happened, exactly the approach Thrawn would have recommended if he had been asked. He had not been asked, but he had noticed the shift and had found it worth noting. The lieutenant was learning, not the specific content of the lessons, the tactical frameworks, the art methodology, the layered intelligence assessments. He was learning something more fundamental, how to watch without filtering what he saw through what he expected to see. That quality, in a person, was rarer than any rank. He began, quietly, to teach Vanto in earnest. The first Imperial campaign assigned to him was, by design, modest in scale. A piracy suppression operation in the Outer Rim, the kind of assignment given to officers whose capabilities were unproven in the institutional context. A problem large enough to be meaningful and small enough that failure carried limited consequence. He had reviewed the available intelligence on the operation in one evening and identified 3 things the previous commanders had missed. Not from access to better information, the intelligence was identical, from reading it differently. The piracy network operating in the sector was not, as the standard analysis had concluded, an opportunistic civilian criminal enterprise. The distribution of its attacks followed a pattern that no opportunistic network would produce. The targets were too specific, the timing too coordinated, the escape vectors too consistent across operations conducted by what appeared to be independent cells. This was not piracy. This was a testing operation. Someone was running those cells to map Imperial response times, patrol patterns, and interdiction capabilities in this sector. The piracy was incidental. The intelligence gathering was the point. He had submitted this analysis with his operational plan. The senior officer reviewing the submission had read it twice, questioned 2 of the supporting conclusions, received one-line responses to each question that resolved both objections completely, and approved the plan without further comment. The operation had concluded in 11 days. Standard projections had indicated 6 weeks. What was captured in those 11 days was not simply a piracy network. Embedded within the network's command structure was an intelligence apparatus whose existence the Empire had not previously confirmed. The data recovered from it reshaped 3 ongoing investigations in unrelated sectors. The report that followed his submission was the first document in his Imperial file that used the word exceptional without a qualifier attached. More campaigns followed, each one assigned at slightly larger scale, each one concluding faster than projected, producing results beyond the stated objective, generating reports that the analysis division processed with increasing attention. The institutional machinery of the Empire began to accommodate him the way a river accommodates a new stone, not by changing its fundamental nature, but by finding the path around, the adjusted current, the slight reshaping of what had been fixed. Officers who resented him were common. Officers who resented him and said so openly were rare, not because the sentiment was rare, but because open resentment required a target, and the difficulty with resenting Mitth'raw'nuruodo was that his results left no purchase for criticism. You could dislike everything about the presence of an alien in a command position. You could find the art collection strange, and the methodology opaque, and the stillness unsettling. You could carry all of that resentment through an entire campaign and arrive at the end of it having watched the alien in the white uniform do exactly what he said he would do, in exactly the time he said it would take, at exactly the cost he had projected. Resentment required a failure to grip. He did not provide failures. What he provided instead, without intention and without particular awareness that it was happening, was something more destabilizing than failure, a standard, a demonstration, repeated across campaign after campaign, of what was actually possible when the gap between intelligence and action was collapsed, when art and analysis and patience operated together rather than in separate departments that did not communicate. Officers who served under him for long enough began to measure other commanders against what they had witnessed, and found the measurement uncomfortable. This was not his concern. The mission was his concern. The mission was always his concern. The second audience with the Emperor was different from the first. The first had been assessment. The walk, the silence, the yellow gaze processing input and filing results. This one was conversation, actual conversation, in the sense that Palpatine asked questions he did not already know the answers to, and listened to the responses with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things he found genuinely useful. They had spoken for 2 hours about the unknown regions, about the nature of threats that did not announce themselves, about the specific limitations of military doctrine designed for known enemies, and what doctrine would look like if it were designed instead for enemies you had not yet identified. About art, which the Emperor had raised himself, with a precision that indicated he had reviewed the methodology notes from the intelligence assessments and found them worth understanding. "You read battle tactics from brushstrokes," the Emperor had said, not a question. "I read what a culture believes about survival," he had replied. "Battle tactics follow from that." The yellow eyes had held on him for a long moment. "Most of my advisors read reports," Palpatine had said. "Reports tell you what happened," he had answered. "Art tells you what a people are prepared to do." Another silence. Then, "What does my empire's art tell you?" He had considered the question carefully, had thought about the imperial aesthetic, the scale, the geometry, the absolute preference for symmetry and repetition, the elimination of anything irregular or organic from official imperial design. Had thought about what that aesthetic encoded at the level where aesthetics become belief, that it was built by people who fear chaos more than they value complexity, he had said, and that this fear will, in time, become its primary strategic vulnerability. The silence that followed was the longest of any in that room. When the Emperor spoke again, his voice carried something that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but lived in the territory between them. "You will be a Grand Admiral," he said. "Not a question, not an offer, a fact, delivered slightly ahead of its own occurrence." The rank came with ceremony, and with 12 white uniformed figures standing in a line, and he was the only one whose face did not look like the institution that had just elevated him. 47,000 crew members would serve aboard his ship. The galaxy's most powerful naval resources would be available to him. The Emperor's conditional trust, which was the only kind the Emperor possessed, and which was still more than most people in that court ever received, was now formally extended. He had stood in that ceremony and felt something he examined carefully afterward, in private. Not pride. He had assessed the feeling against pride and found it different. What he felt was something closer to recognition. For the first time in his career, in his life, a power structure had looked at the full shape of what he was and decided it was useful at the scale it actually operated. Not useful at a reduced scale, not useful if slightly diminished and repositioned at the edge, useful, as is, at full capacity, Given the resources the capacity required, the Chiss Ascendancy had never offered this. He was aware, with complete clarity, that the Emperor's recognition was not affection, was not trust in any form that a person who valued him would offer, was a calculation, the coldest possible form of regard, a mind looking at a tool and identifying the correct application. He understood what he was to Palpatine, an instrument, an exceptional one, an instrument that would be maintained at high function for exactly as long as it served the Emperor's larger purposes and discarded or redirected the moment that calculation changed. He had accepted this, not from desperation, from arithmetic. The Empire's scope was the only scope large enough for what needed doing. The threats in the unknown regions were real and old and patient and moving, and the only force in the galaxy with the resources to address them at the necessary scale was the one whose Emperor had just said, "You will be a Grand Admiral," in the tone of someone reading a fact from a document. Serving that Emperor, instrument, tool, exceptional asset to be deployed and maintained, and eventually discarded, was the cost of the mission. He had paid larger costs for smaller returns. The ceremony concluded. The 12 Grand Admirals dispersed. He returned to his ship, to his gallery, to the third hour, and the amber light, and the art of 43 cultures lining the walls around him. Vanto had been waiting outside the gallery door. "Congratulations, sir," the lieutenant had said. He had paused at the door, had looked at Vanto, the young man from wild space who had arrived as an observer and become, in the months between, something closer to a student, and something closer still to the only person aboard this ship who spoke to him in the direct register. "Walk with me," he had said. They had walked the length of the gallery together, past the carved stone and the clay figure and the textile from the border world, and all the other pieces that told, in their various ways, the truth about what people were willing to sacrifice for the things they believed in. He had not told Vanto what the ceremony had felt like. He had not needed to. Vanto had looked at the art on these walls and then looked at him and understood, in the way he had learned to understand across months of careful observation, that the man standing in this gallery was not celebrating. He was calculating the terms of an agreement, and the terms were already costing something. The blue light of the viewport settled over everything in the third hour, cold and still and present, the color of a people who had sent him to the edge, and a system that had collected him from there, the color of the space between belonging and use, the color that the galaxy, in the end, had decided was acceptable as long as it won battles. Outside, Coruscant glittered in every direction. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, as information, as a text that, read correctly, would tell him what it was prepared to do. The first time he read Nightswan's work, he almost admired it too much to act. Not the tactical work, though that was considerable. The kind of operational planning that most Imperial analysts had spent months trying to reverse engineer, and had consistently arrived at conclusions that were one step behind where the actual thinking had already moved. What stopped him, briefly, in the low amber light of the gallery at the third hour, was a handwritten letter recovered from a safe house on Danash. 7 paragraphs, no recipient named, no date, written in the specific register of someone who did not expect the words to be read by anyone other than themselves. The direct register, the one below performance, the one that told the truth without deciding to. He had read it 3 times before setting it down. The man who wrote this letter was not a criminal, was not, in any framework that honest accounting could produce, an enemy of anything worth protecting. He was someone who had looked at the systems around him, the imperial apparatus grinding through the outer rim, the specific weight of administration that pressed hardest on the people least equipped to absorb it, and had decided, from principle rather than profit, that resistance was the only honest response available. Thrawn had held the letter for a long moment. Then he had placed it in the file beside the tactical assessments and the network maps and the intercepted communications, and had returned to the operational planning that the letter had briefly interrupted. The mission required Night Swan stopped. What the mission required was not, in the end, a question. Kulos Megan, known in Imperial intelligence files as Night Swan, the designation attached to a pattern of operations before a face or name could be confirmed, had been active in the Outer Rim for 3 years before the Chimera was assigned to the suppression campaign. In those 3 years, he had dismantled 4 separate Imperial extraction operations, redirected 2 mining contracts that had been established on terms that effectively indentured the local workforce, and organized a series of freight slowdowns that had cost the Imperial supply chain in this sector an amount that the logistics division preferred not to calculate publicly. He had done all of this without a single confirmed act of violence against Imperial personnel. This was, from a purely operational standpoint, the most interesting thing about him. The networks Thrawn had dismantled before this assignment had been built by people who understood violence as a primary tool, who used force to establish authority within their own organizations as much as against external pressure. Night Swan used something else: persuasion, the specific kind that came from being right about things in ways that people could verify themselves. He did not ask his people to trust him. He showed them the accounting, laid out the numbers, let the reality of their situation make the argument he would otherwise have had to perform. This was, Thrawn had noted, how a Chiss officer built loyalty. He had set that observation to one side and continued reading. Their first indirect contact came through a captured courier, a young woman from Baton who had been carrying coded cargo manifests that Night Swan's network used to coordinate freight movement. The codes were sophisticated, layered in a way that suggested the person who designed them understood Imperial cryptography well enough to build something that would take standard analysis several weeks to process. He had processed it in an evening, not because the codes were simple, because the design philosophy behind them was visible if you knew what to look for. The structure was not random obfuscation, it was principled obfuscation, built on a specific theory about how Imperial analysts approached layered encryption. Understanding the theory made the layers readable. What the manifests revealed was a supply network of considerable elegance. Night Swan was not hoarding resources or diverting them for personal enrichment. The accounting was too careful, too precisely distributed for that. The network was functional redistribution, taking from channels that moved material toward Imperial contractors and redirecting toward communities whose relationship with those contractors had produced outcomes the official reports described as regrettable and did not revisit. He had mapped the entire network from the manifests. Then he had set the map aside and thought, for longer than the operational timeline strictly required, about the mind that had built it. Vanto had noticed. He noticed most things now, the particular silences, the extended pauses over specific documents, the moments when the standard pace of the Grand Admiral's processing slowed in ways that had nothing to do with complexity of the material. "The network map is complete, sir," Vanto had said, standing at the door of the gallery. "Command is expecting the interdiction plan. Command will receive it," he had replied, without turning from the viewport. A pause. "The courier is still in holding. She hasn't provided additional contact names." "She won't," he had said. "She doesn't know them. The network is deliberately compartmentalized. Each node knows only what it needs to function. The person who designed it understood that loyalty has limits and built accordingly." Another pause. "That's a strange thing to admire in an enemy, sir." He had turned then, had looked at Vanto with the specific quality of attention that the lieutenant had learned. over many months, to receive without flinching. Admiration and action are not in conflict, Lieutenant. Understanding what a thing is does not prevent you from doing what the mission requires regarding it. The two processes are separate. Vanto had held the look. Are they, sir? Separate? He had not answered. The interdiction plan had been submitted the following morning. It was, by every assessment that reviewed it, precise and efficient and complete. The network it described dismantling had taken 3 years to build. The plan required 19 days to execute. The campaigns across the outer rim that followed were a kind of education, not for him, but for the Imperial officer corps that observed them. He did not fight the way doctrine prescribed. He did not move against an operation until he understood it completely. Its logic, its dependencies, its human architecture, the specific fears and loyalties and principles that held each element in place. This process took longer than standard interdiction timelines. What it produced was not a disrupted network, but a dismantled one. Not a scattered enemy, but a comprehensively finished one, with no remaining structure to rebuild around. The officer corps watched this and called it methodical. What it actually was something closer to the reading he did in the gallery. Total understanding before any action. The map of a thing built completely in the mind before a single piece of it was touched. Not because touching it prematurely was tactically inefficient, though it was, but because acting without understanding was, at some level he had never fully articulated, a form of disrespect to the enemy, to the complexity of what they had built, to the reality of what they were. Nightswan was the one opponent across all those campaigns who seemed to understand this about him. Their engagement stretched across 14 months and covered 6 separate sectors. For most of that time, they had never occupied the same system simultaneously. The contact was indirect, move and counter-move, each one reading what the other had done and responding to what it revealed about the thinking behind it. He would close a supply route, and Nightswan's response would confirm 3 things he had suspected about the network's backup architecture. Nightswan would redirect a shipment, and the redirection would tell him something about how the man assessed Imperial patrol patterns that the patrol commanders themselves had not articulated so clearly. It was, in the specific and uncomfortable way of things that could not be said in official reports, the most interesting professional relationship of his Imperial career. The letter from Danash was not the only writing recovered. As the campaign progressed and safe houses were processed, a small collection accumulated. Notes, fragments, one longer document that appeared to be a working draft of a proposal Nightswan had apparently been developing for presentation to someone with the authority to act on it. The proposal was for a restructuring of Imperial resource extraction contracts in the Outer Rim. Specific, detailed, financially coherent. It acknowledged Imperial interests and worked within them, not against them. It was the work of someone who had not yet given up on the possibility that the system could be persuaded rather than resisted. He had read the draft twice and understood, from its existence, a great deal about the timeline of Nightswan's radicalization. This document was old, predated the network by at least 2 years. The man who wrote it had believed once that the right argument in the right room could change the right mind. Something had ended that belief. What had ended it was not, he suspected, a single event. It was the accumulation of careful arguments going into rooms and producing no change in the rooms. It was the specific exhaustion of being right in ways that the systems around you could not accommodate. It was, and this was the part he set down quickly and did not examine at length, a feeling he recognized from a different angle, from the inside of a different institution, from years of border reports sitting in queues, while the darkness beyond pressed patiently against every marker. He recognized the shape of it. He did not say this in any report. The capture came at the end of the 14th month, on a station above a system whose name appeared in no imperial strategic document of consequence. Night Swan had made a choice, a deliberate one, judging by the absence of the evasion patterns that had characterized every prior contact. He had allowed himself to be found, had walked into the situation with full knowledge of what it contained, and had sat down across from the Grand Admiral with the quiet expression of someone who had finished calculating and arrived at an answer they had not wanted but could not dispute. They had spoken for 2 hours, not an interrogation. An interrogation implied the seeking of information that one party held and the other required. He already held everything the network had produced. What occurred across that table was something harder to categorize. Two people who had spent 14 months reading each other through the work each one left behind, finally occupying the same room, the same air, the same unhurried conversation. Night Swan had asked at one point whether the Grand Admiral believed the Empire was worth serving. He had considered the question with the attention it deserved. "I believe the alternative is worse," he had said. "The threats that the Empire, for all its failures, currently contains, they do not share your principles or mine. They will not be persuaded by correct arguments. The question of whether the Empire deserves its position is separate from the question of what fills the space if it collapses." Night Swan had looked at him for a long moment. "You know that's not what you actually believe," the man had said quietly. "You believe the threats are real. You're not certain the Empire is the right vessel for addressing them. You serve it anyway because you have no better option and the clock is running." The silence that followed had lasted long enough to be its own answer. "What would you have done differently?" Thrawn had asked, "if the proposal had been accepted?" Night Swan had almost smiled. "Gone home," he said. "Watched my people keep what they built. Slept through the night." The conversation had ended shortly after. The order was not difficult to give. That was the part he examined most carefully afterward, in the gallery at the 3rd hour, holding a fragment of Night Swan's handwriting and reading it the way he read art. The order had not been difficult. The mission required it. The network, even dismantled, could rebuild around a living architect. The principle of the thing, left breathing, would find new infrastructure. The operational logic was complete and unambiguous. He gave the order and stood in his gallery afterward with the handwritten letter from Danash. 7 paragraphs, no recipient, no date, and read it again in the amber light. The man who wrote this letter was not a criminal. He read that fact the way he read the unfinished corner of the Togrutan weaving, as a deliberate statement made with full knowledge about the gap between what the world was and what it could be honest enough to admit. Night Swan had stopped his proposal the way the Togrutan artist had stopped the threads. Not from failure, from a clear-eyed accounting of what the system around him was capable of receiving. He had been right about that too. The mission required him stopped. That was what he told himself, in the 3rd hour, with the letter in his hands and the amber light steady on the walls around him. The lie was precise, constructed from true materials. Every element of it was accurate, and every element together produced something that was not. He knew this, filed it under acceptable losses, placed the letter back in the case where the rest of Night Swan's writing was kept, not destroyed, not archived in the standard system, kept here, in this room, on a shelf below the Togrutan weaving, and turned back to the viewport. Outside, the stars were fixed and cold and indifferent to the accounting of men who served causes larger than themselves and paid for it in ways that did not appear in any official record. He stood there until the 4th hour came. The letter remained on the shelf. It would stay there. He would never read it again. He would never stop knowing exactly what it said. She painted on walls. That was the first thing his intelligence reports confirmed about Sabine Wren. Not her Mandalorian training, not her Imperial Academy history, not the weapons modifications that had cost 3 separate garrison commanders their equipment and very nearly their lives. Those details were in the file. They were noted and assessed and filed in their appropriate categories. What stopped him was the walls. Wherever the Ghost crew operated, wherever they passed through long enough to leave a mark, she left color behind. Not signatures, nothing so simple as a tag or a territorial claim. What she left were statements. Compressed, urgent, built from a visual language that carried inside it the specific weight of Mandalorian artistic tradition, a tradition he had studied carefully across 3 separate acquisitions, 2 recovered texts, and 1 crumbling mural fragment from a world the Empire had processed and moved past without looking at what it had walked through. He looked at reproductions of her work for a long time before he looked at anything else in the Rebel Cells file. The color choices were not decorative. The orange and yellow she returned to, almost compulsively, across pieces that varied in every other respect, carried a specific cultural coding in Mandalorian tradition. Not warmth, not energy, mourning, expressed in fire's palette, because Mandalorian grief did not perform itself in darkness and stillness. It burned. It made itself visible. It insisted on being seen in the specific way that people insist on being seen when they are afraid of being forgotten. She was painting for someone who was gone. He noted this with the same attention he brought to everything, closed the reproduction file, and opened the tactical assessment for the Ghost Cell's last 6 operations. The tactical assessment was impressive. The paintings were more so. The cell called themselves the Ghost Crew after their vessel, a modified VCX-100 light freighter that had been evading Imperial pursuit for long enough that the pursuit had begun to feel, in certain quarters of the regional command structure, like a personal embarrassment. He had reviewed the pursuit records before accepting the assignment and had found them educational, not about the cell, but about the commanders who had failed to stop them. Each failure shared a common structure. The pursuing officer had assessed the Ghost Crew as a tactical problem and applied tactical solutions. Faster ships, larger formations, more comprehensive patrol grids. Each escalation had produced the same result: a cell that was still operational, a vessel that was still flying, and an after-action report that described the engagement in language designed to minimize the appearance of defeat. He had read all of them. Then he had begun building a different kind of file, not tactical, personal. The specific qualities of each member of this crew, not their capabilities, which the existing assessments covered adequately, but the interior architecture of those capabilities. What drove each of them? What they protected first when situations collapsed? What they would and would not sacrifice? And where the line between those 2 categories was drawn, and what the line revealed about the wound underneath. Hera Syndulla he understood within the first week. She flew the way people fly, when the sky over a specific piece of ground means something. Not flight as freedom, not flight as escape, but flight as return. Every operation the Ghost Crew ran in the Lothal sector brought them back. Not because the sector was strategically optimal, because Lothal was hers, in the way that things become yours when you have bled for them long enough that the bleeding and the belonging become the same act. She was not fighting for the rebellion in the abstract. She was fighting for a planet, for the specific quality of air above a specific piece of ground that she intended to see free before she was done. This was, tactically, a vulnerability. It was also, he noted in the margin of the file, the most honest thing he had read in a military assessment in years. Kanan Jarrus was a Jedi who had survived the Purge by becoming someone the Purge could not find, not through power, not through hiding in places the Inquisitors could not reach, but through the specific discipline of a man who had learned to carry enormous things very quietly. The force was present in him the way deep water is present beneath shallow ground. Not visible on the surface, not absent, pressing upward through everything he did without announcing itself. He studied the reports of Kanan's engagements with the same attention he brought to art, what he protected, when he could only protect one thing, the specific quality of his relationship with the boy. Ezra Bridger, youngest member of the crew, Lothal-born, force-sensitive, in ways that the Inquisitors had twice failed to contain. The boy was the variable he could not fully model. Not because Ezra's capabilities were exceptional, they were developing, inconsistent, the particular unpredictability of someone still becoming rather than already formed. The difficulty was different. The boy operated from a place that standard military psychology had no category for. He was not disciplined, not trained in any framework that produced predictable outcomes. What he was, in every engagement report that mentioned him specifically, was responsive, to the moment, to the people around him, to something that the reports could not name and that he suspected had nothing to do with strategy at all. He had written a note in the margin of Ezra's file. "This one does not play by the rules of the game I am playing." Then he had underlined it, set the file aside, returned to it twice more before the campaign was 3 months old. The victories accumulated, each one precise, each one producing exactly the outcome projected, each one failing, in ways the after-action reports did not capture, to produce the result that the victories were supposed to add up to. The Ghost crew survived, not by matching him tactically. They could not match him tactically. The resources were too unequal, the asymmetry too fundamental. They survived because they were not trying to win the same war he was fighting. He was dismantling a military threat. They were keeping something alive. The difference in objective produced a difference in what counted as failure. He could destroy their base, scatter their assets, eliminate their support networks, and the crew would emerge from the wreckage with the specific quality of people who had lost the thing they were standing in, and not lost the thing they were standing for. He had noted this pattern after the 3rd engagement, had noted it again, with slightly different language, after the 7th. Around him, the imperial political structure of the Outer Rim produced its own kind of friction. Governor Arinda Price was competent in the specific way of people who had constructed their competence from survival rather than training. Shrewd, politically precise, capable of the kind of patience that administrative power required and military command rarely rewarded. She was also, in ways that became clearer across the months of the campaign, afraid of him. Not of his capabilities, of what his capabilities revealed about the limitations of everyone around him. The officers beneath him operated at levels that his planning consistently outpaced. He had built systems to accommodate this, briefings structured to give each officer exactly the information their role required, and nothing that would require them to synthesize beyond their demonstrated capacity. The system worked. The campaigns ran on schedule. The gap between what he was doing and what his officers understood about what he was doing widened quietly with each passing month. Vanto saw it, mentioned it once, carefully. "The senior staff is following your orders, sir. I'm not certain they understand why." "They do not need to understand why," he had said. "They need to execute correctly." Vanto had been quiet for a moment. What happens when executing correctly requires understanding why? He had not answered that one either. Sabine Wren's file grew thicker as the campaign extended. More walls, more color. The orange and yellow returned in every piece, sometimes dominant, sometimes compressed into a single line at a composition's edge, present regardless, the grief fire burning at whatever scale the surface allowed. He tracked the evolution across pieces recovered from 3 separate systems, and noticed something that the intelligence analysts who cataloged them had not recorded. The compositions were becoming more deliberate. Earlier work had the quality of urgency. Made fast, made hot. The statement more important than the structure. Recent pieces showed something different. The urgency was still there, compressed now into tighter forms. The grief fire controlled rather than released. She was learning to hold it. He understood, from this, that she was becoming more dangerous. Not because controlled grief was more powerful than released grief. In tactical terms, the difference was marginal. But because a person who had learned to hold the thing that drove them had learned something fundamental about the distance between feeling and acting, and that distance, in an opponent, produced unpredictability of a different and more difficult kind. He acquired a small piece, not from the Ghost crew directly, from a sympathizer location that had been processed and cleared. A fragment of Mandalorian patterned work, orange and yellow on gray, the fire palette against the cold of stone. He placed it on the shelf below the Togrutan weaving, beside the case that held Night Swan's letters. His gallery was becoming a record of people he was trying to stop. He did not examine this too carefully. The night before the assault on Atollon, the Chimera held its position at the edge of the system, and the crew ran through final preparation cycles, and the third hour came quiet and cold across every deck. He stood in the gallery. The amber light was the same as every other night. The art on the walls held their positions. The carved stone, the clay figure, the Togrutan weaving with its deliberate gap, Night Swan's case, the Mandalorian fragment, 43 cultures in carefully calibrated light. Everything in its place, everything read, assessed, understood as fully as understanding was possible. Tomorrow, the rebel fleet at Atollon would be destroyed. The tactical architecture for the engagement was complete. Every exit blocked, every counter-move predicted, every variable he could model accounted for. He had run the assessment 11 times across as many days. The outcome did not change. The Ghost crew was there. Hera, who flew for a specific piece of ground. Kanan, who carried his weight quietly. Sabine, whose grief burned in fire colors on whatever surface she could reach. Ezra, who did not play by the rules of the game he was playing. He stood in front of the Mandalorian fragment for a long time. The orange and yellow held their positions in the gray, the fire palette burning without consuming. The grief fire controlled now, held, compressed into something that had learned its own shape. The blue light from the viewport fell across the shelf below it, across the case that held Night Swan's letters, across the fragment, across all of it, and something in the quality of that light at that hour, on that specific night, was different from every other night he had stood in this room. He could not have said how. He stood there until the third hour passed and did not move, and did not look away. Tomorrow the fleet would be destroyed. He was certain of this. He stood in the gallery anyway, in the blue light, and looked at a piece of Mandalorian work that a young woman had made from grief and fire, and the specific determination of someone who intended to still be standing when people who underestimated her had finished being certain. The third hour came, then went. He remained. The battle went exactly as planned. For 6 hours, it went exactly as planned. Every exit vector sealed before the rebel fleet understood it was sealed. Every counter-formation predicted and answered before it fully developed. The Chimera moved through the engagement with the specific quality that his operations always carried. Not urgency, not aggression, but the quiet momentum of a thing that has already been decided, working its way through the formality of being decided in front of witnesses. His officers executed correctly. The rebel commanders made the responses he had predicted they would make. The formations shifted. The escape attempts came in the sequences he had projected. The desperation increased in the pattern. That desperation always followed when people with fewer resources found every option closing simultaneously. He watched the sensor feeds and spoke in measured sentences, and made 3 minor adjustments to the secondary positioning across the 6 hours, each one small, each one sufficient. The engagement was nearly over. Then the Purgil came. They arrived without warning on any instrument the Chimera carried. Not because the instruments were inadequate, because the Purgil did not move through space in ways that instruments were built to detect. They moved through something adjacent to space, something that registered on no sensor array and preceded no radiation signature and announced itself with no electromagnetic trace. One moment the outer sensor grid showed nothing. The next moment the creatures were inside the engagement perimeter, enormous and silent, and utterly indifferent to the battle occurring around them. He had 3 seconds to process this before the first one made contact with the fleet. In those 3 seconds, he ran every category of tactical response available to him against this specific variable and found that none of them applied. The Purgil were not a military force. They had no formation, no objective, no command structure to target. They could not be negotiated with, intimidated, or redirected through the application of superior firepower. They were not attacking the Imperial fleet. They were simply present, moving through the engagement zone in the direction they had been moving before the engagement zone existed, carrying in their enormous bodies the same indifference to Imperial strategy that deep space carries to everything, except one of them was not indifferent. One of them, the largest, carrying Ezra Bridger on its back in a manner that no tactical assessment had ever modeled, because no tactical assessment had ever modeled this, had a direction, specific, deliberate. The Chimera. He had written in Ezra's file, "This one does not play by the rules of the game I am playing." He had underlined it. He had not understood, when he wrote it, how completely accurate it was. What followed did not have a clean tactical description. The Chimera was seized, physically, by creatures whose strength operated at scales his weapon systems were not calibrated to address, and pulled, not destroyed. Not disabled in any sense that damage reports were designed to categorize, moved, taken from the engagement, from the sector, from the known space where Imperial authority had a shape and a name, and pulled into the unknown regions at a velocity that no hyperdrive had produced, into the darkness beyond the edge. Into the same darkness he had spent his career warning about. The same darkness he had left the Ascendancy to find resources large enough to address. The same darkness that had been pressing patiently against every border marker for as long as there had been people with enough sense to hold border markers. He had been taken there by a child on a creature's back. The battle at Atollon, by the time the Chimera was gone from it, had produced a rebel fleet that was damaged and diminished, but not destroyed. His officers, competent in the specific way of people executing a plan they had not fully understood, had not known how to adapt to the sudden absence of the variable that had been doing the actual thinking. The fleet survived. He noted this from a distance that was no longer measurable in any unit the Empire used. The unknown regions were not what he had expected. He had built extensive theoretical models of this space across years of intelligence work and border assessment, and the specific kind of educated projection that fills gaps in information with the most probable content. The models were accurate in their broad architecture and wrong in their texture, in ways that became apparent almost immediately. The darkness was not empty, it was full of things that had been here longer than the Republic, longer than the Sith, longer than any political structure the known galaxy had produced. Things that had been patient in ways that his most careful modeling had not fully captured, because patience of that duration operated on principles that military planning had no framework for. He was here now. He stood on the bridge of the Chimera and looked at sensor readings that no Imperial cartographer had ever filed, and felt, for the first time in a career built on the elimination of surprise, that he was genuinely in new territory, not unprepared. He was never unprepared, but the preparation he had was for problems shaped by the logic of known space, and this place did not share that logic in ways he was still in the process of identifying. Ezra Bridger was somewhere in this darkness too. Days passed. The Chimera held position while he ran assessments, and his officers waited, and the darkness outside held its various contents in the patient way it had always held them. He slept in intervals shorter than he usually permitted himself. Arta, without attention to the food, moved through the ship in the measured pace that his crew read as composure, and that was, in its way, composure, but composure as discipline rather than calm, the practiced maintenance of a bearing that the situation would have otherwise disturbed. At the 3rd hour of the 7th day, he went to his gallery. The amber light came on, as it always did. The art held its positions, the carved stone, the clay figure, the togrutan weaving with its deliberate gap, Night Swan's case, the Mandalorian fragment, 43 cultures in carefully calibrated light, the same room it had always been, the same positions, the same amber warmth over everything. He stood in front of a piece he had owned for 4 years and never fully read. It was the smallest thing in the gallery, a palm-sized fragment of worked material from a culture he had not been able to identify despite extensive research. The angles of its surface cutting suggested a relationship to physical space that no known aesthetic tradition approached. He had acquired it from a trader who did not know what it was, catalogued it carefully, placed it in the gallery, and returned to it periodically across 4 years with the same result each time: partial understanding, incomplete, the full meaning remaining just beyond the edge of what he could reach. Every other piece in this room had eventually yielded, had eventually given up its interior logic to sustained attention and the right framework of knowledge. This one had not. He stood in front of it now, in the unknown regions, in the dark, in the 3rd hour, with the blue light from the viewport falling differently than it had ever fallen in known space. Colder, somehow, less certain, the light of stars that no imperial chart had named. He looked at the small fragment. The fragment held its silence, the way it always held its silence, complete, patient, neither refusing him nor offering anything, simply present, simply itself, a thing made by hands he could not identify, in a tradition he could not locate, for a purpose that remained genuinely unknown. Something moved in his chest at that, in the 3rd hour. Not grief, not quite. Something adjacent to grief. The specific quality of a feeling that arrives when you understand, for the first time, that a limit you have always theoretically acknowledged is actually real. That there are things that cannot be read, no matter how much patience and knowledge and sustained attention are brought to bear on them. That the gap between what he could understand and what existed was not a problem to be solved with better methodology. It was simply a gap. He stood with that for a long time. The 3rd hour came, then went. He stood there past it, into the 4th, into the beginning of the 5th, longer than he had ever stood in this room, without the standing producing something, without the attention arriving somewhere. The fragment held its silence. Outside, the unknown regions held theirs. He was still standing there when Vanto appeared at the gallery door to inform him that the navigation team had completed initial stellar cartography and required his assessment. He turned from the fragment, walked to the door, did not look back. Something in the room stayed behind him as he left, a quality of the air, a weight in the amber light, something that the gallery held after he was gone, that it had not held before he stood there that long, that still, in the dark past the 3rd hour, in front of the one thing he could not read. What he had decided, in that room, he did not say to Vanto. He did not say it to anyone. Whatever it was, he carried it into the unknown regions without a name for it, and the Chimera moved deeper into the dark, and the gallery behind him held its art and its amber light and the small fragment that had never given up what it contained. And the blue light from the viewport fell over all of it, colder now, less certain, the light of unnamed stars, and the room was very still. The officer was 24 years old and had the specific posture of someone who had learned to stand correctly before he had learned why standing correctly mattered. He came from wild space. That much was in the file. A border region posting, a family with outer rim trade connections, an academy record that placed him in the upper tier without placing him at the top of it. He held his datapad with both hands when he presented his intelligence summary, which was a small habit that most senior officers would not have noticed, and that meant, to anyone paying attention, that the information on the datapad mattered to him personally, not professionally, personally. He had been building this particular investigation for 4 months without being asked to. The sympathizer network he had identified was real. The analysis was sound, careful, layered, built from the kind of sustained attention that most officers at his rank did not bring to work, that no one had specifically assigned them. He had found the network because he had been looking for it, had been looking because something in the patterns of a routine cargo audit had bothered him, in the specific way that things bother people who have not yet learned to stop being bothered by things that do not fit. He was good. He would be better. He stood in front of the Grand Admiral's desk and presented his findings with the contained energy of someone trying very hard not to appear as invested as he was. Grand Admiral Mitth'raw'nuruodo listened to the full presentation without interruption. "Read the supporting documents," asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which the officer answered correctly and with appropriate supporting detail. Then he set the datapad down. "File this with the Regional Intelligence Division," he said. "Standard processing." The officer blinked. Standard processing meant a queue. A queue meant weeks, possibly months, and the network would have moved 3 times before anything acted on the analysis. The officer knew this. It was visible in the brief tension around his eyes, the recognition, quickly suppressed, that the response did not match what the work deserved. "Yes, sir," the officer said, took the datapad, left. The door closed. He sat for a moment in the silence the officer had left behind, looking at the space where a young man with both hands on a datapad had stood, and did not examine the specific reason he had stopped a 4-month investigation that deserved to be continued. Simply stopped it, filed the reason under things that did not require examination, moved to the next item. The rank carried a weight that had nothing to do with the insignia. Grand Admiral, 1 of 12, commander of the 7th Fleet, a force whose resources exceeded the combined military capacity of most systems that considered themselves significant. The Emperor's instrument for the Outer Rim campaigns. The figure that regional governors positioned themselves around, that junior officers adjusted their career trajectories to intersect with, that enemy commanders restructured entire strategic frameworks upon learning, was in the sector. He had held this rank for long enough that the weight of it had become ordinary, not comfortable. He did not think he had ever been comfortable in the specific way that people meant when they used the word, but ordinary. The rank was the shape of his days, the way the 3rd hour was the shape of his nights, a constant, a fixed point around which everything else organized itself. What the rank could not do, had never been able to do, was fill the particular silence that Vanto's absence had left. Eli Vanto was gone, sent ahead, into Chiss space, carrying knowledge and skill that the Ascendancy needed, and that Thrawn had spent years building in him, for exactly this purpose. The sending had been correct. The mission required it. Vanto was more useful there than here, and the calculation was unambiguous, and he had made it with the same precision he brought to every calculation. The correctness of it did not change the quality of the silence. He had not replaced Vanto. had accepted a series of capable aides in the administrative sense. Officers who processed communications, managed schedules, coordinated the logistical machinery of a fleet of this size. None of them came to the gallery. None of them would have understood why the gallery existed. The direct register, the one below performance, the one that told the truth without deciding to, had not been available in this ship since the morning Vanto had gone. He had not said this to anyone. There was no one to say it to. The second decision came from Lothal. Governor Arinda Price submitted the request through proper channels, a formal communication, correctly structured, outlining the military and political rationale for an orbital bombardment of a specific district. The resistance in the district was real but marginal. The military value of the action was limited. The political value, the message sent to other systems watching whether the Empire would act decisively in its own territory, was, by the calculation Price presented, sufficient justification. He read the request twice, reached for the intelligence files on Lothal's cultural history, the specific documents he maintained on every planet in his operational theater, the art assessments, the cultural analyses that told him what a people believed at the level where belief became structure. His hand stopped before the files opened. He sat with that stillness for a moment, the hand on the desk, the files unopened, the request from Price waiting for a response. He had never given an order of this kind without first understanding what the order was destroying, not from sentiment, from methodology. You could not accurately assess the cost of an action without understanding the value of what the action consumed. The art told him the value. The art had always told him the value. He had not opened the files. He approved the request, sent the authorization through proper channels, correctly structured. The bombardment was executed. The district was destroyed. The message was sent to the watching systems. He did not go to the gallery that night, sat instead at his desk in the third hour, in the dark, not reading anything. He had told himself, approving the request, that the political calculation was sound, that Price's assessment of the regional impact was accurate, that the mission, the larger mission, the one that justified everything else, required maintaining the political relationships that gave him operational freedom. All of this was true. None of it was why he had not opened the files. He knew why he had not opened the files. The files would have shown him something he did not want to carry into the decision, would have given the district a texture, a human weight, a cultural specific gravity that the clean language of Price's request did not contain. He had known, reaching for those files and stopping, that opening them would make the decision harder. He had chosen the easier version of the decision. For the first time, he sat in the dark of the third hour and did not examine this too carefully, and the amber light in the gallery down the corridor stayed off, and the art on those walls held its various truths in the darkness without him. The report to the Emperor took 11 days to compose, not because the content was complex. The strategic assessment was clear, the recommendations logically derived, the supporting analysis thorough in the way that all his documents were thorough. 11 days because he wrote it, reviewed it, revised specific sections, and returned to it 4 times across those days, with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered enough to be done exactly right. What it recommended was restraint, not retreat. He had chosen the language carefully, understanding that the Emperor's relationship with that word made it unusable regardless of context. Restraint, a consolidation of imperial resources in the sectors that mattered most strategically, a deliberate reduction of engagement in the outer theaters where the cost of operations exceeded the value of the positions being held. The rebellion was not being defeated by force of arms. It was being sustained by the overextension of the imperial response, by a military apparatus spreading itself across too many theaters, too thin, generating too much friction, against populations that might otherwise have remained neutral. The recommendation was correct. He had run the analysis from 11 different frameworks and arrived at the same conclusion each time. He submitted the report and waited. 3 days passed, then 7. At the 3rd hour of the 14th day, he stood at his gallery viewport, with the stars fixed and cold outside the transparistile, and understood that the silence was not administrative delay. The Emperor had read the report. The Emperor had chosen not to respond. This was itself a response, the most specific one available, delivered in the language of absence rather than language. It said, "Your analysis is noted. Your recommendation is declined. The reason for the decline will not be provided, because the reason is not something you are required to understand, only to accept." He stood at the viewport for a long time. The blue light, the specific shade of his own reflection in dark transparistile, the color that no human officer on this ship shared, the color he had carried his entire life through every institution that had found uses for it without finding a home for it, settled over the room in the 3rd hour with the quality it always carried, but different tonight, fainter somehow, or not fainter, the same intensity, but landing differently, as though the surface it was falling on had changed in ways not visible to external inspection. He looked at his reflection. The reflection looked back, still, patient, the red eyes catching the starlight in the way they always caught it, the white uniform exactly as it should be, everything in its correct position. And he understood, standing there with the Emperor's silence where acknowledgement should have been, something he had been constructing the understanding of for a long time without permitting it to complete itself. The Emperor did not intend to win this war through strategy. The Emperor did not, in the framework that his yellow eyes operated within, experience the rebellion as a strategic problem requiring strategic solution. He experienced it as a purification process, a fire that burned away everything, insufficiently loyal, insufficiently afraid, insufficiently committed to the specific vision of order that Palpatine had spent decades building toward. The rebellion was useful. It justified the fear, it justified the fleet deployments, and the tightening administrative grip, and the steady compression of every freedom that might otherwise give people somewhere to stand that wasn't the Emperor's shadow. Winning was not the point. He had spent years fighting a war that his commanding authority did not actually want won. The report sat in whatever system received reports. The Emperor chose not to answer. The stars outside were fixed and cold. His reflection held its position in the transparistile, blue and still and present, carrying the weight of 11 days of careful work and 14 days of silence, carrying everything it knew about threats that were real and patience that were running out, and a mission that the institution around him had never shared in the way he had believed it shared it. The fleet would move toward Lothal. He would go, would plan, would execute with the same precision that had defined every engagement of his career, would position every piece correctly, predict every countermove, close every exit before it opened. He knew exactly how this would go. Not the battle he could control. What came after the battle? That was the part he had always known, somewhere below the part of him that filed things under acceptable losses and moved to the next item. Had known and not examined. He turned from the viewport. The gallery held its art and its amber warmth, and the small, unidentifiable fragment on the shelf that had never given up what it contained. He walked out. The door closed behind him. The fleet moved toward Lothal. The bridge of the Chimera was 170 meters long. He had never measured it himself. The number existed in the ship's technical documentation, filed under structural specifications, that most commanding officers read once, during initial posting review, and did not return to. He had read the full documentation twice, not from thoroughness as performance, but because the specific dimensions of a space shaped how people moved through it, and how people moved through a space told you things about what the space did to them over time. 170 meters of transparasteel and durasteel, and the particular gray that Imperial designers had chosen for every surface of every ship of this class. A gray that communicated authority without warmth, precision without comfort. The aesthetic of a system that had decided long ago that beauty was a civilian concern. Officers on this bridge stood at their stations with the practiced posture of people who had learned that the gray expected something from them and had chosen to provide it. He walked the length of it every morning at 0600 hours. Not an inspection. The crew understood the distinction. He was not looking for failures. He was reading the bridge the way he read everything else, for what it revealed about the current state of the people inside it, the quality of attention at each station, the micro-adjustments in posture that indicated fatigue versus alertness, versus the particular tension that preceded significant operational activity, the conversations that stopped when he passed versus the ones that continued, and what the difference between those two categories communicated about the crew's relationship with their own work. By the time he reached the far end and turned back, he had a complete picture of what this ship was carrying into the day ahead. He had been doing this for 3 years aboard the Chimera. The picture it gave him was always accurate. It had never once given him what he was looking for. Grand Admiral, Commander of the 7th Fleet, the Emperor's instrument in the Outer Rim. 12 men in the galaxy held this rank, and he was the only one whose face registered as wrong to the institution that had given it to him. The insignia on his white uniform was identical to the insignia on the uniforms of 11 human men, whose names the Imperial historical record would preserve with a different quality of attention than it would preserve his. He had understood this from the beginning. The rank brought resources that no previous position in his career had approached. The 7th Fleet, its full complement of star destroyers, its fighter squadrons, its ground assault capacity, its intelligence apparatus, was an instrument of a scale that the Chiss Ascendancy had never offered and the Empire had withheld until his results made withholding it indefensible. He had earned this fleet engagement by engagement, report by report, the accumulation of outcomes that could not be argued with, producing eventually a position that could not be denied. What the fleet gave him was reach. What reach gave him was the ability to address, at the necessary scale, the problems that had driven every decision of his career since the first border engagement the Ascendancy had called reckless. He should have felt, commanding from this bridge, something proportionate to what he had sacrificed to stand here. He had assessed the feeling carefully, in the 3rd hour, on multiple occasions. What he found was not proportionate. The physical experience of peak Imperial power was quieter than the external presentation suggested. From outside, from the perspective of the officers who served under him, the governors who negotiated with him, the rebel commanders who restructured their entire operational frameworks upon learning his fleet was in the sector, the Grand Admiral, at the height of his career, was a figure of enormous and somewhat frightening presence. The stillness read as certainty, the precision read as omniscience, the white uniform and the red eyes, and the voice that spoke in measured sentences that never required repetition, produced, in observers, the impression of someone operating at a level beyond ordinary human cognition. From inside, the experience was a man standing at a viewport at the 3rd hour, thinking about a letter he would never read again, and an unidentifiable fragment that would never give up what it contained. The resources were real, the reach was real. The outcomes his fleet produced were real and significant, and, in the framework of the mission he had always been serving, necessary. None of this was performance or illusion. He was, by every external measure, exactly what the rank said he was. The distance between what a thing looked like and what it held inside, he had read that distance in 43 cultures worth of art, had understood it as a universal condition of made things, whether made by hands or made by careers. The outside of a thing and the inside of a thing were not the same thing. This was not tragedy. It was simply the nature of surfaces. He had applied this understanding to everything except himself for a very long time. In the third hour, at the viewport, with the stars fixed and cold outside the transparistile, the application had begun to feel less avoidable. His quarters were adjacent to the gallery. This was a modification he had requested during initial posting, a non-standard configuration that the ship's designers had accommodated without comment, because Grand Admirals did not explain their spatial preferences to ship designers. The adjacency meant that the transition between sleeping and the gallery required no corridor, no distance, no interval in which the pull of the work could be interrupted by the architecture of the ship. He slept less than his officers believed he slept, not from discipline, from the specific quality of his mind at the third hour, which was not restful in any sense that rest required. The third hour was when the processing that had been running underneath the day's operational demands surfaced without the day's structure to organize it. Thoughts that had been filed under not yet during working hours arrived at the third hour without asking permission. He had learned, across years of this, to go to the gallery rather than lie in the dark, waiting for the thoughts to finish. The gallery in the third hour was different from the gallery at any other time. During the day, it was a workspace, functional, purposeful, the place where intelligence became understanding and understanding became operational planning. Officers who entered it during working hours experienced it as an extension of the command structure, slightly unusual in its decor, fully legible as a professional environment. At the third hour, the amber light fell differently on everything. The carved stone caught it from one angle and absorbed it from another, the shadows in its grooves shifting with the quality of something that had been waiting for the room to empty before showing what it actually was. The Togrutan weaving held its deliberate gap in colors that were warmer at this hour than at any other. The small, unidentifiable fragment on the lower shelf sat in the amber with the same patient silence it always maintained, neither giving nor refusing, simply present in the way that some things are simply present regardless of what you bring to them. He stood in this room at the third hour and was, in the specific sense that mattered most, alone. Not alone in the administrative sense. 47,000 crew members breathed and worked and slept within the hull around him. Not alone in the professional sense. His schedule was full, his communications constant, his operational presence required across more simultaneous theaters than most officers managed in a career. Alone in the sense that the room at the third hour contained exactly one person who understood what the room contained. That had always been true. At the height of his power, it was simply more precisely true. The reports he sent to Coruscant in the months following Atollon were among the most detailed he had ever produced. Not from anxiety. Anxiety was not a register he operated in, or had not been, for a very long time. From the particular quality of attention that arrives when a person understands that the window for a thing is closing and wants the record to be complete before it closes. Each report laid out with absolute clarity the state of the Outer Rim campaigns, the current capabilities of the Rebel Alliance, the specific strategic adjustments that the situation required, and the projected outcomes across multiple scenarios depending on which adjustments were and were not made. Each report was acknowledged with the automated confirmation that the Imperial communication system applied to all received documents. None received a substantive response. He had continued sending them. Not from hope. He had assessed what the silence meant, and the assessment was accurate, and he was not the kind of person who revised accurate assessments to produce more comfortable conclusions. He sent them because the record mattered, because somewhere in the archive of Imperial communications, a complete and accurate picture of what this war had actually been, and what it had actually required, and what had been chosen instead of those requirements, would exist for whoever came after to read. He thought, sometimes, about who would read it. Did not permit himself to think about this for long. The Death Star's destruction at Yavin arrived in his communications as a tactical report filed under significant military losses. He read it twice, set it down, stood at the gallery viewport for a long time. Not grieving the weapon, he had never placed strategic faith in the Death Star in the way that Tarkin had placed it, the way the Emperor had placed it, the way the entire upper architecture of Imperial military thinking had organized itself around the assumption that a weapon of sufficient scale made strategy unnecessary. He had disagreed with this assumption from the first briefing in which it was presented to him, had disagreed in terms that the briefing officer had received with the expression of someone deciding not to record what they had just heard. He had been right. He had been right, and the weapon was gone, and 60,000 people had died in it, and the Emperor was silent, and the rebellion had survived another engagement it should not have survived. And the specific quality of what he felt, standing at the viewport, was not satisfaction at having been right, and not grief at the loss, and not the anger that the officers around him were carefully not expressing in his presence. What he felt was the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a true thing in a system that did not want it for long enough, that the carrying had become the largest fact of his existence. He was the most capable military mind the Empire possessed. He was serving an emperor who did not want this war won. He was protecting a people who had exiled him. He was commanding a fleet whose officers executed his orders without understanding them. He was standing in a gallery at the third hour, alone, at the height of everything he had worked toward, and the height felt exactly like every other elevation he had reached, in a career built on reaching elevations that turned out to contain the same view. Capable, isolated, right. The three things had always traveled together. He had simply not permitted himself, until recently, to feel how heavy they were as a set. The Chimera's crew celebrated small victories, the way all military crews did, quietly, in the spaces between duties, with the particular relief of people for whom relief was brief and professional, and never quite sufficient. He observed this from the appropriate distance, not coldly, with the specific warmth of someone who understood what was being celebrated, even when the celebration could not reach him. They were good people, most of them. The ones who had lasted in his service had been selected, whether they knew it or not, by a process that retained the ones who were genuinely trying to do the work correctly, and gradually redirected the ones who were trying to do something else. The crew of the Chimera was, by the third year of his command, a finely calibrated instrument. They deserved a commanding officer who could tell them the truth about what they were part of. He could not tell them the truth about what they were part of. The truth was not something the mission permitted him to distribute. The truth was, this war is being managed, not fought. The truth was, the Emperor does not want the outcome that you are working toward. The truth was, your competence and your sacrifice are being deployed in service of a strategic vision that I have assessed as fundamentally flawed and cannot correct from inside the system I am operating in. He walked the bridge at 0600 hours instead. Read the posture and the attention and the quality of people trying to do their work correctly. Filed it under the things he carried that did not appear in any report. The third hour, on the night after Yavin, was the longest he had spent at the viewport since the unknown regions. The stars outside were fixed and cold and indifferent, in the specific way of things that have existed longer than any of the wars being fought beneath them. The blue light of his reflection in the transparisteel was fainter than it had ever been. Not actually fainter, he understood, but received differently by the person standing inside it. The same light, a different surface. He looked at his reflection for a while. The reflection looked back, still, patient, the white uniform correct in every detail, the red eyes catching the starlight, everything in its proper position. He thought about the togrutan weaving on the wall behind him, the deliberate gap, the threads gathered at the edge, prepared for a completion that the artist had chosen not to provide. The incompletion as the most honest statement available, the refusal to pretend the world was finished when the world was not finished. He thought about the letter on the shelf, the 7 paragraphs written by a man who had also understood the distance between what systems promised and what they delivered, and had also continued anyway, for as long as he could. He thought about Vanto, somewhere in Chiss space, carrying knowledge forward into a people who were still, through intermediaries and carefully managed distances, benefiting from everything he had built in this empire that would never fully claim him. He thought about the darkness beyond the edge, still moving, still patient, still pressing against every marker, with the calm of something that understood that time worked in its favor. He turned from the viewport, walked to the shelf below the togrutan weaving, picked up the small, unidentifiable fragment and held it in his palm for a moment. The first time he had held it rather than simply standing before it. The surface was cool. The angles of its working caught the amber light in the ways they always caught it, the shadows shifting with the specific quality of something that had been waiting for this particular attention without knowing it was waiting. He held it for a long moment, set it back. The fleet would receive its orders in the morning. The campaigns would continue. The reports would be filed and acknowledged and not responded to, and the war would proceed in the direction it was proceeding. And he would continue to be the most capable instrument in a system that was using him for purposes he had fully understood and partially accepted and could not, from inside, correct. Something was already ending. Not the fleet, not the rank, not the white uniform or the red eyes, or the precision that 47,000 crew members organized their days around. Something inside the carrying. Something that had been holding a very specific weight for a very long time, and had begun, in the 3rd hour, at the viewport, with the stars indifferent and the reflection faint and the fragment cool in his palm, to understand the difference between choosing to carry a thing and simply never having put it down. The amber light held everything in the gallery exactly as it always held it. He walked out, the door closed. The fleet moved toward what was coming. He had known for a long time what was coming. He had simply never permitted himself to know it at the 3rd hour, in the gallery, with his hands empty and the reflection faint in the transparisteel, and the silence where the Emperor's response should have been. Now he did. Now there was nothing left to file it under. Gilad Pellaeon had served under 11 commanding officers across a career that spanned 3 decades and 2 galactic governments. He had served under men who led through fear, and men who led through inspiration, and men who led through the specific bureaucratic momentum of people who had risen high enough that the institution carried them forward, regardless of what they personally contributed to its direction. He had served under one officer who was genuinely brilliant and had watched that brilliance curdle, over years, into the particular arrogance of someone who had stopped learning because learning implied the possibility of being wrong. He had never served under anyone like Mitth'raw'nuruodo. This was not admiration speaking, or not only admiration. Pellaeon was not a man given to uncritical regard for superior officers. 30 years of service had burned that tendency away early and replaced it with something more durable. the capacity to assess accurately without the assessment requiring either worship or resentment. He could look at a commanding officer and see clearly what was there, without needing what was there to be more or less than it was. What was there, in the Grand Admiral, was something Pelion had spent 3 years trying to find adequate language for, and had not fully succeeded. The closest he had come, in the private journal he maintained in encrypted files that he would have denied existed if asked directly, was this. He sees the engagement before it happens, not as prediction, but as memory, as though the battle has already occurred somewhere inside him, and he is simply waiting for the external version to catch up. He had written this during the 2nd year of his posting aboard the Chimera. In the 3rd year, he had added one line beneath it. Something is changing. I cannot identify what. I am watching carefully. The hesitation Pelion noticed first occurred on a Tuesday, Order Day, in the Imperial weekly structure, during a routine tactical review of Outer Rim patrol distributions. It was not a significant hesitation. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, between the senior navigation officer's question and the Grand Admiral's response. In a different commanding officer, 4 seconds would have registered as normal processing time, unremarkable, beneath the threshold of anything worth noting. In this commanding officer, who had never in 3 years of Pelion's observation required more than 2 seconds to respond to any tactical question, regardless of complexity, 4 seconds was a different kind of interval entirely. The response, when it came, was correct. Precisely correct, as always. The adjusted patrol vectors that the Grand Admiral specified were, as Pelion confirmed through his own subsequent analysis, exactly optimal for the current threat distribution. Nothing in the content of the response indicated anything other than the standard functioning of the most capable tactical mind Pelion had ever observed in operation. It was the 4 seconds. Pelion had looked, in those 4 seconds, at the Grand Admiral's face. The expression had not changed. It never changed in any way that human faces usually changed when their owners were experiencing something internal. The micro-movements around the eyes, the almost imperceptible tension at the jaw, the slight shift in breathing that most people produced without knowing they were producing it. The face was as still as it had always been, but the eyes, in those 4 seconds, had not been on the tactical display. They had been on nothing that existed in the room. Pelion had returned his own gaze to his station before the Grand Admiral's focus came back, had made no note of it in any official record, had added 3 words to the encrypted journal that evening, watching more carefully. Lieutenant Cole Mawson had served aboard the Chimera for 14 months and had been corrected by the Grand Admiral exactly twice. Both corrections had occurred in her first month. Both had been delivered in the same manner. A quiet, precise identification of the specific error and the specific reasoning that would have prevented it, with no additional commentary, no emotional weight attached, no implication that the error reflected anything about her beyond the error itself. She had implemented the corrections. No further corrections had followed. She had told this story to a fellow lieutenant named Draven over evening mess, approximately 8 months into her posting, and Draven had listened and said that his own experience had been identical. 2 corrections in the first month, precise and impersonal, and then nothing. And they had compared notes with 3 other lieutenants at the table and found the same pattern across all of them, and had sat with this information for a moment before Draven had said, quietly, "He corrects you until you stop making the kind of mistake he can predict. After that, he doesn't correct you because he's already accounted for your remaining errors in the operational plan." The table had been quiet for a moment. "That's efficient," Mawson had said. "That's lonely," Draven had replied. Nobody had disputed this. What Mawson noticed, in the months that followed that conversation, was the gallery. She passed it on her route between her duty station and the officers' mess, a corridor she walked 4 times daily. The gallery door always closed during working hours, the amber light visible as a thin line beneath the door in the early morning, and at the 3rd hour, when she occasionally pulled double shifts. The thin amber line had been a constant across her entire posting. The gallery existed and was occupied at the 3rd hour, and this was simply a fact of serving aboard the Chimera, as established and unremarkable as the gray of the walls. What changed, in the 3rd year, was the duration. The amber line began appearing earlier. Not dramatically earlier, 30 minutes, sometimes 45, before the usual 3rd hour, and it persisted later. She began to notice it still present when she arrived for first duty cycle. The gallery occupied through the transition between the 3rd hour and morning, the Grand Admiral having apparently not slept in the interval between. She mentioned this to no one, filed it in the same private category where she kept the story about Draven's observation and the 2 corrections in her first month, and the specific quality of service aboard this ship, which had always felt like being part of something that operated at a register slightly above what she could fully hear. Ensign Dorothy Quellen was 21 years old and had been assigned to the Chimera 6 months before the Lothal campaign concluded. He had not been aboard long enough to have a baseline for comparison. What he knew of the Grand Admiral was only the current version, the 3rd-year version, the version that Pelion was watching carefully, and Mawson was filing in private categories, and a dozen other officers were accumulating small observations about, without sharing them with anyone else. To Quellen, this version was simply the Grand Admiral, still, precise, present in a room in a way that reorganized how everyone else in the room carried themselves. The red eyes that registered everything without appearing to focus on any single thing. The voice that spoke in sentences that never required repetition or clarification. What Quellen had, that the longer-serving officers did not, was the specific clarity of someone who had no prior version to compare against. He saw only what was there. What was there, he had written in a letter to his older brother that he later decided not to send, was a man who has finished deciding something and is waiting for the external circumstances to catch up with what he has already decided internally. I don't know what he decided. I don't think he knows I can tell. I don't think he knows anyone can tell. The letter sat in his personal files unsent. He was 21 and could not have explained how he knew this. He knew it anyway. The piece of Lothal landscape art arrived 6 weeks after the campaign concluded. A junior intelligence officer, not Quellen, not Mawson, someone from the acquisitions division whose name does not appear in any subsequent record, had recovered it from a civilian structure near the Lothal capital that had been processed during the final stages of the campaign. The piece was modest in scale, painted on flat board in a style that was distinctly local, the particular palette of Lothal's grasslands at a specific time of day, the golden green of the plains before the industrial extraction had reached this particular valley, the sky above it, the specific shade of a world that was still, when this was painted, capable of being painted in this color. The officer had brought it to the gallery because the standing instruction for recovered cultural materials in the operational theater was to bring them to the gallery. This was a standard directive that had been in place since the Grand Admiral's first posting. Everyone who had served for more than 3 months knew it. He knocked twice, entered when acknowledged, presented the piece. The Grand Admiral took it, what the officer reported afterward, quietly, to one colleague who mentioned it to another, the information moving through the ship's informal channels in the way that significant observations move through closed communities, was the pause. Not a long pause, but long enough. The Grand Admiral had held the Lothal landscape painting and looked at it, and the officer had watched him look at it, and something in the quality of that looking was different from every description the officer had heard of how the Grand Admiral usually looked at art. Usually, the looking was active. You could almost see the processing, the layered assessment, the intelligence work running beneath the surface of the stillness. It was the looking of someone receiving information. This was not that. This was the looking of someone recognizing something. The Grand Admiral had held the painting for a long moment. Then he had set it face down on the shelf, not filed, not hung, not placed in the catalogued position that every other piece in the gallery occupied with the precision of a system that had been carefully maintained for years. Face down, on the shelf, the painted surface against the surface below it, the landscape hidden, the back of the board facing up, plain, unworked, revealing nothing. "Thank you," the Grand Admiral had said. The officer had left. The piece remained face down. Pelion learned about it 3 days later, from the colleague the officer had told. He added nothing to the encrypted journal that night, sat for a while in his own quarters with the information and did not know what to do with it, and went to sleep having made no decision about what to do with it. Some things did not require a response. They simply required being known. On the far side of the galaxy, in the cold outer edge of the Chiss Ascendancy, a council session concluded with no public record of its agenda. This was not unusual. The Ascendancy maintained extensive archives of official proceedings and extensive parallel archives of proceedings that did not appear in the official ones. The informal record was, in many cases, the more accurate document. Decisions made in officially unrecorded sessions carried the specific weight of choices that their makers understood could not survive public examination, not because they were shameful, but because some decisions were too complicated for the frameworks that public records required. The session in question had concerned itself with a single subject. The Ascendancy's intelligence apparatus had been monitoring the imperial career of Mitth'raw'nuruodo for years through channels that both parties understood existed and neither officially acknowledged. The intelligence that had moved through those channels, information about unknown region threats, about specific pressures along borders that the Ascendancy held without imperial awareness, about the nature and location of forces that had been building in the dark for longer than the Empire had existed, had been received, assessed, and incorporated into Ascendancy strategic planning with the thoroughness that Chiss analytical culture applied to all useful information. The source of that information was not officially credited anywhere in the Ascendancy's strategic documents. He did not appear in any official record as an active asset. He did not receive communication through any channel that could be traced to the Ascendancy's formal intelligence structure. He was, in the official architecture of Chiss institutional memory, an exiled officer whose postings in the imperial military were monitored as a matter of standard external intelligence practice. What the council session had addressed was a question that had been circulating in unofficial channels for several months: whether the intelligence relationship should be formalized, whether the Ascendancy should extend something, not reinstatement, nothing so dramatic, but acknowledgement, a channel through which communication could move in both directions, with something closer to reciprocity. The session concluded without resolution, which was, in the language of Chiss institutional decision-making, itself a decision. The intelligence would continue to be received. The source would continue to be unacknowledged. The arrangement would continue to function in the way that arrangements function when they are useful to one party and the other party has no leverage to require anything different. One council member had raised, near the end of the session, a question that the official non-record did not capture, but that two attendees remembered clearly enough to recount separately, years later, to people who eventually wrote it down. The question was, does he know we are watching? The answer, offered by a second council member after a brief silence: he has always known. That is not the relevant question. The relevant question, left unasked because its answer was already understood by everyone in the room, was whether knowing made any difference to what he continued to do. It did not. It never had. This was, perhaps, the most Chiss thing about him, the willingness to serve a purpose that would not serve him back, because the purpose was real, and the alternative was the purpose going unserved. The council session ended. The arrangement continued. He remained, in the Ascendancy's official memory, absent. Pelion stood on the bridge 3 days before the final Lothal engagement and watched the Grand Admiral review the tactical display. The review was thorough. It was always thorough. Every element of the planned operation present and correctly positioned, every contingency accounted for, every variable that could be modeled having been modeled and assigned a response. The precision was identical to the precision of every previous tactical review Pelion had observed across 3 years aboard this ship. What was different was a quality he could not put in a report, something in the posture. Not the external posture. That was as correct as it had always been. The stillness that junior officers had learned to read as total composure, and that Pelion had learned, over time, to read as something more complicated than composure. Not the posture of the body, the posture of the attention. For 3 years, the Grand Admiral's attention during tactical reviews had carried a specific quality of forward orientation, not eagerness, nothing so simple, but a directedness. The attention went toward the problem. It was fully engaged with what was in front of it, processing, planning, already several moves ahead of where the display currently showed. Today the attention was still precise, still accurate, still producing the same quality of output that it had always produced. But it was not forward. It was somewhere else entirely, present enough to function at the highest level, absent in a way that Pelion had no category for, and no language to describe, and no official record in which to place the observation. He watched the review conclude, watched the officers receive their assignments with the confidence of a crew that had served under this command long enough to trust the planning completely, watched the Grand Admiral walk the length of the bridge toward the rear, pause, briefly, at the viewport, look out at the stars, fixed and cold and indifferent, for exactly 4 seconds, then continue walking. The door at the rear of the bridge closed. Pelion stood at his station and looked at the tactical display and looked at the closed door and understood, in the specific way that 30 years of service had given him the capacity to understand things he could not prove, that what he was watching was not a commanding officer preparing for a campaign. It was a man recognizing an ending, not with despair, not with resistance, with the specific quality of someone who has known a thing was coming for long enough that the knowing has become its own kind of companionship, and the arrival of the thing itself is not a surprise but a confirmation. The end was not a surprise. It was a recognition. Pelion added nothing to the encrypted journal that night. Some things, written down, became smaller than they actually were. This was not something he was willing to make smaller. He left it the size it was. The Chimera drifted, not damaged. The hull was intact, the systems operational, the crew present at every station performing every function that crew members at every station were supposed to perform. The ship was not broken in any way that damage reports were designed to measure. It moved through space with the same structural integrity it had carried into the engagement above Lothal. The same engines, the same weapons capacity, the same 170 meters of gray durasteel that Pelion had walked alongside a commanding officer every morning at 0600 hours for 3 years. What it did not have was a direction. The navigation team had their coordinates. The operational orders were filed and accessible and had not been rescinded through any official channel because no official channel had been used to rescind them. Every procedural element of the Chimera's operational existence was intact and present and functioning. But the ship drifted, because the thing that had given the coordinates their meaning, the thing that had made the operational orders more than documents, that had transformed the 170 meters of gray corridor into something that moved with purpose rather than simply moving, was gone. And the crew, trained to function without being told how to feel, functioned, and the ship drifted. What had happened above Lothal would be described in official Imperial records, in language that the language was not sufficient to contain. The records would note the arrival of Purgil, would note the unauthorized actions of Ezra Bridger, would note the disruption to fleet formations, the loss of command continuity, the operational outcome classified under categories that the existing classification system had not been built to accommodate. Subsequent reports would attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events from sensor logs and crew testimony, and those reconstructions would be accurate in their external architecture and wrong in every way that mattered about the interior of what had occurred. What had occurred, stripped of the language that official records required, was this: a child who did not play by the rules of the game being played had called something from outside the game entirely. And the something that arrived, enormous, ancient, indifferent to Imperial strategy, in the specific way that living things older than any political structure are indifferent to political structures, had reached into the engagement and taken the Grand Admiral out of it, not destroyed him, not defeated him, taken him into the unknown regions, into the same darkness he had spent his career studying, warning about, trying to acquire sufficient resources to address, into the place the Chiss Ascendancy had sent him when he became too much for them to hold, and from which the Empire had collected him, and which had received him now through a mechanism that bore no relationship to either exile or collection. The Purgil did not make strategic calculations. They did not assess threat levels, or consult intelligence files, or read the art of the cultures whose space they moved through. They moved through space the way water moves through ground, following something that existed below the level of strategy, below politics and ranks, and the careful careers of careful people, below everything except the deep current that ran through living things and connected them to each other, and to the vast impersonal darkness between stars. Ezra Bridger had spoken to that current. The current had answered. And Mitth'raw'nuruodo, Grand Admiral, commander of the 7th Fleet, the most capable military mind in Imperial service, the only non-human to hold that rank, the man who read battle tactics from brushstrokes and predicted fleet formations from sculpture, and had spent his entire life being right in ways that cost him everything, had been carried into the dark by creatures that responded to something his methodology had no framework for, and his art collection had never contained. The irony did not announce itself. It simply existed, the way true ironies exist, quietly, completely, without requiring acknowledgement to be accurate. Pelion sat in the Admiral's chair for the first time 40 minutes after the engagement concluded. He did not sit in it immediately. The 40 minutes were spent in the specific activity of a senior officer managing a situation for which no protocol existed, directing the crew through the post-engagement procedures, assessing damage, establishing communication with the surviving fleet elements, beginning the documentation that would eventually constitute the official record of what had happened above Lothal. He did all of this standing, at the tactical display, in the position he had occupied as second in command for 3 years. Then, the immediate requirements were addressed, and the crew was functioning, and there was nothing left that required him to remain standing at the tactical display instead of occupying the chair that was now, by the unambiguous logic of rank and circumstance, his to occupy. He sat in it. The chair was not different from any other chair of its type aboard a ship of this class. The design was standard Imperial, functional, precisely engineered, built to support a commanding officer across long operational periods without producing either discomfort or the kind of comfort that encouraged inattention. He had sat in identical chairs aboard other ships across 30 years of service. This one felt different, not because of any physical property, because of the specific quality of absence that surrounded it, the absence of the person who had occupied it, whose occupation of it had given the entire bridge a particular quality of orientation, the way a fixed point gives a room its sense of direction. The chair was present. The fixed point was gone. He looked at the tactical display for a while. Then he looked at the door that led to the gallery corridor. He had never entered the gallery during his 3 years aboard this ship. The gallery was the Grand Admiral's space, not officially restricted, never formally closed to senior officers, but understood by everyone who served here to be a place that was entered by invitation, and that invitation had never been extended. You did not walk into the Grand Admiral's gallery the way you did not stand in someone's private silence. The boundary was not a rule. It was a recognition. The recognition no longer applied in the same way. He stood from the chair, walked to the door, opened it. The gallery was smaller than he had imagined. He had constructed a mental image of it across 3 years of passing the closed door and hearing descriptions from the handful of crew members who had entered it on official business. The intelligence officers delivering acquisitions, the technical staff who maintained the lighting systems, the young officer who had brought the Lothal landscape piece and come back with the story of it being set face down. From these fragments he had assembled something larger in his mind, more imposing, more deliberately constructed as a statement of authority. What he found was a room of modest dimensions with amber light falling evenly across objects, arranged with the care of a person who had thought deeply about where each thing should be and why. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he stepped inside. The carved stone caught the amber light from one angle and held shadow in its grooves from another, the shadows shifting as he moved, the piece alive in a way he had not expected from stone. The clay figure on its pedestal was smaller than he had pictured, small enough to hold in a palm, the kind of object that should have looked insignificant in a room of this scale and somehow did not. The Togrutan weaving on the far wall was the largest piece, red and ivory threads in patterns that he stood in front of for a long moment, not reading them in any analytical sense, simply receiving whatever they were willing to give to someone who had not spent years learning to ask the right questions. What they gave him was something he could not name precisely, a feeling that the room had been used for something important, that the air in it carried the weight of that use, the accumulated third hours, the amber light falling on thinking that had shaped campaigns and outcomes and the lives of people who would never know the room existed. The weight was not dramatic. It was the ordinary weight of sustained attention, of a mind returning to the same place across years of returning, of presence so consistent that the room itself had absorbed something of it. He moved slowly along the wall. The case on the lower shelf, Night Swan's letters, though he did not know this, had never been told the case's contents, sat in its position below the weaving with the specific quality of something that had been placed carefully and not moved. He did not open it. He looked at it and understood, from its positioning and the care with which it had been placed, that it mattered in a way that was not catalogued anywhere. The small fragment on the shelf beside the case, the unidentifiable piece, worked at angles that his eye could not quite resolve into a coherent aesthetic tradition. He picked up without fully deciding to pick it up. It was cool in his palm. The angles of its surface caught the amber light and redirected it in ways that produced shadow patterns he could not predict from any position he shifted to. He held it for a moment, then set it back with the specific care of someone who understood they were handling something that deserved to be handled carefully, without being able to say exactly why. The Lothal landscape piece was face down on the shelf where it had been placed and not moved. He looked at it for a long time, did not turn it over, left it as it had been left. In the weeks that followed, the Empire processed the loss of its Grand Admiral through the mechanisms that institutions use to process the loss of individuals they cannot fully account for. There was no body, there was no confirmed location. There was sensor data and crew testimony, and the reconstructed sequence of events, and none of it added up to a conclusion that the available categories were equipped to contain. The official classification that was eventually applied, missing in action, status unknown, was accurate in its specific content and completely insufficient as a description of what had actually occurred. The Seventh Fleet was reassigned. Its component ships distributed across other commands, the operational continuity of the Grand Admiral's ongoing campaigns transferred to officers who implemented the plans they had been given and did not always understand why the plans were shaped the way they were, and who found, across the months of implementation, that the plans continued to produce outcomes beyond their apparent parameters. Because the planning had been built with contingencies several layers deep, and those contingencies kept functioning long after the mind that had built them was gone from the theater. The Chimera remained under Pelian's command. He ran it differently than it had been run. He knew this, made no attempt to replicate what he could not replicate, and did not resent his own limitations in the specific way of someone trying to fill a space that was not shaped for them. He ran it as himself, competently, carefully, with the 30-year officer's understanding of what he was good at and where his edges were. The crew adapted. Competent crews adapt to competent commanding officers, and this was a competent crew. The gallery remained closed during his command, not by order, by the same unspoken recognition that had kept it closed during the years when the man who used it was present. He walked past the door at 0600 hours, did not stop, kept the pattern because keeping it felt like the one small thing he could do that acknowledged what had been. The Chiss Ascendancy received no official notification. There was no channel through which official notification would have traveled, given that no official channel acknowledged the relationship that would have made notification meaningful. The intelligence apparatus learned what it learned through the same back-channel monitoring that had tracked the Imperial career for years, and what it learned was absorbed into the Ascendancy's strategic assessment with the thoroughness that Chiss analytical culture applied to all useful information. The source of that information was noted in the internal assessments that did not appear in official records as no longer active. What replaced the active intelligence was silence, the specific silence of a channel that had been transmitting steadily across years and had stopped. Not terminated, not concluded, simply gone quiet in the way that things go quiet when the person maintaining them is no longer available to maintain them. One analyst, preparing the updated strategic assessment for the council session that would formally acknowledge the change in the intelligence relationship, wrote in the private notes that accompanied her official document a single observation that was not included in the final submission. The information we received from this source across the years of his imperial service was, in retrospect, sufficient to have changed the Ascendancy's strategic posture in the unknown regions significantly if we had acted on it with the urgency it warranted. We did not act on it with urgency. We received it, assessed it, incorporated it at the pace our processes permitted, and did not ask ourselves whether our processes were adequate to the timeline the information described. He knew this about us. He continued providing the information anyway. I do not know what to do with this observation. I am including it in these notes because it seems like the kind of thing that should exist somewhere in writing, even if it cannot exist in the official record. The notes were filed. The official document was submitted. The council session concluded. The Ascendancy continued. The darkness beyond the edge continued its patient work. The question the galaxy could not answer was simple in its form and impossible in its content. Was he still alive? The unknown regions were not, in any technical sense, incompatible with survival. Ships had entered that space and returned. People had passed through its edges and come back with information, with data, with the specific kind of experience that could only be acquired by going somewhere and enduring it and making it back. The unknown regions were dangerous and unmapped and full of things that operated on principles the known galaxy had not yet encountered, but they were not, categorically, fatal. The purrgil that had taken him, creatures that moved through hyperspace the way birds move through air, with the casual certainty of beings for whom this was simply the medium of existence, had not destroyed the Chimera, had not destroyed him, had moved him, had taken the ship and its commanding officer out of one space and deposited them in another, and the depositing had been survival compatible in the sense that surviving it was physically possible. Whether he had survived it was not known. Whether he had found, in the unknown regions, the threats he had spent his career warning about, the patient pressures, the darkness moving at timescales longer than political structures, the forces that had been building beyond every border for longer than the Republic had existed, was not known. Whether he was standing, somewhere beyond every map the Empire had ever drawn, at a viewport in the third hour, looking at stars that no imperial chart had named, reading something in the texture of this uncharted space that the rest of the galaxy did not yet know to fear. This was not known. What was known was the gallery. What was known was the amber light, still functioning, still falling at the angles it had always fallen across the objects that remained in their positions. The carved stone, the clay figure, the togrutan weaving with its deliberate gap, the case on the lower shelf, the small fragment that held its silence and gave nothing away. The Lothal landscape piece, face down, the grasslands hidden, the golden green of a world that had wanted to be something other than what the Empire had made of it, preserved in paint against a surface pressed to a shelf. These things remained. 43 cultures represented on these walls. 43 windows into the interior of peoples who had never chosen to be studied by the man who had studied them, who had given, in their art, the truth about what they were willing to sacrifice, and had had that truth received by someone who had understood it completely and used it, and had also, in the receiving of it, been changed by it in ways that the using did not cancel. The art remained, the amber light remained, the third hour remained, arriving each night at its appointed time, the ship's chronometers marking it with the same precision they marked every other hour, the darkness of the ship at that hour, holding the same quality of quiet that it had always held. What did not remain was the blue, the specific blue, the deep, impossible blue of skin that no human officer on any ship of this fleet had ever shared, the color that had sat at the center of every room he had ever entered and made the room different by its presence, the color that the galaxy had never quite known what to do with and had spent his entire career using anyway. That blue was gone from the gallery, gone from the viewport, gone from the transparasteel where a reflection had stood in the third hour for years, patient and still, carrying the weight of everything into the long white blur of transit, or the fixed cold points of real space, or the unnamed stars of a region no chart contained. The room held the amber light. The room held the art. The room held the silence of a space that had been used for something important by someone who was not there to use it anymore. And the blue was simply gone, not destroyed, not concluded, not resolved into any ending that the available categories could fully contain. Gone the way things go that have been taken somewhere beyond the edge of what can be followed. present still, perhaps, in some room above some system that no Imperial navigator had ever filed coordinates for. Still standing, perhaps, at some viewport at the third hour, in light that fell differently than any light in known space, on a reflection that looked back with the same patience and the same red eyes and the same precise attention that it had always carried, or not. The galaxy did not know, could not know, would not know, for a very long time, and possibly not then. What Pelion carried, in the years that followed, was not grief exactly. Grief required a confirmed loss, something that had been present and was now definitively absent, the absence established beyond dispute, the loss contained in a shape the mind could work with. What he carried was something without a clean shape, the specific weight of uncertainty held over time, of a question that remained open because the information required to close it did not exist and might never exist. He had served under 11 commanding officers. He would serve under others in the years and decades that followed, would watch governments rise and collapse and reform, would see the empire become something it had never intended to be, and the Republic return in forms that resembled and did not resemble what had come before. He would carry his 30 years, and then his 40 years, and then more than that, through changes that remade the galaxy several times across a lifespan that outlasted the institution he had served when he was young. Through all of it, he kept the encrypted journal, added to it occasionally. Small observations, private assessments, the kind of thinking that a person does when they understand their thinking is for no one but themselves. The last entry that mentioned the Grand Admiral was not written at a dramatic moment, not at the conclusion of a battle or the fall of a government or any of the large events that marked the years. It was written on a quiet evening, on a ship that was not the Chimera, in a cabin that looked nothing like the bridge he had walked for 3 years. It said, "I have been thinking today about the gallery, about the amber light at the third hour, about the way a room holds the shape of the person who used it for a while after they are gone. The shape fades eventually. Everything fades. What does not fade, I think, is the question. The one he carried that none of us could fully see. Not what he knew. We have written down what he knew, or as much of it as we understood. Not what he did. The record exists for that, incomplete and partially wrong but present. The question he carried that none of us could see was what it cost him, specifically to be exactly what he was, in a galaxy that used what he was without ever fully receiving it. I do not know the answer to that question. I am not certain he knew it either. I think he went into the dark still carrying it. I think that if he is out there somewhere, standing at some viewport at the third hour above some unnamed system, he is still carrying it. I think the carrying was the most honest thing about him. The journal entry ended there. Pelion closed the file. Outside the viewport of his cabin, space held its fixed cold points of light. The stars that had been present before every war and every government and every man who had ever stood at a viewport at the third hour, believing that what he was doing mattered enough to justify the cost of doing it. The stars did not have an opinion about this. They simply burned, cold and patient, and present in the darkness, the way things are present that have been burning long enough to stop needing anyone to observe them. In a gallery on a ship above Lothal, the amber light fell at the third hour, on 43 cultures worth of art and one face-down painting of grasslands in a color the world no longer wore, and a small fragment that had never given up what it contained, and a case of letters from a man who had also understood the distance between what systems promised and what they delivered. The blue light that had stood in the viewport at the third hour for years was not there. The room was not empty. It held everything he had left behind, the art and the amber and the silence of sustained attention, the weight of a life carried with precision through spaces that were never quite large enough to contain it. The shape of a person pressed into the things they returned to when the performance of the day was done, and what remained was only what was true. The third hour came. The amber light held. The viewport showed stars, and somewhere beyond the last map the Empire ever drew, in the dark that had always been waiting at the edge of everything, the question he had carried continued, in whatever form questions continue, when the person who held them has gone somewhere that answers do not reach. Not answered, not lost, simply carried, into the blue, into the cold, into the dark beyond the edge of everything the galaxy knew how to find.